Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. San Francisco had been cool that evening, a gentle ocean breeze rolling in from the bay, bringing with it the scent of salt and damp concrete. The city felt alive, as it always did after dark. Lights flickering in storefronts, neon signs humming softly, cars passing in the distance. It had been a good dinner at Scotty's on Lombard, nothing fancy, but filling and warm. We hadn't even thought twice about parking 3 blocks away. In a city like this, it was normal. I remember stepping onto the sidewalk outside the restaurant, zipping up my jacket against the chill, feeling the weight of a good meal settling in my stomach. The street lights cast long shadows, stretching across the pavement, warping as we moved. The city had that usual background noise, distant conversations, tires rolling over asphalt, the occasional honk. It was normal, just a regular night. We started walking, the pavement uneven beneath my feet, the kind of sidewalk that had seen years of foot traffic, cracked here and there from tree roots pushing up from underneath. The air smelled like car exhaust and something faintly greasy from a restaurant nearby. I could hear the hum of the city, muffled through the buildings, like a pulse just beneath the surface of everything. We were passing by a motel, nothing particularly nice, just one of those old, run-down places you see in cities. 2 stories, faded blue paint peeling around the edges, flickering neon vacancy sign in the window. The kind of place that felt like it had been there forever. And then, the sound, a sharp, blaring car alarm split through the air, the kind that jolts your nerves, that high-pitched wailing that makes you instinctively tense up. Almost at the same time, there was something else, a scream, a woman's scream. Desperate, panicked, then another, and another. We turned toward the sound immediately. There, in the dim parking lot of the motel, was a Cadillac with its doors wide open. The hazard lights blinked, casting the scene in rhythmic flashes of red and yellow. The alarm continued its frantic wailing. And inside, chaos, A woman was in the back seat, partially hanging out of the car, her body twisting and jerking violently as 2 men beat her. Fists swinging, one of them gripping what looked like a gun, bringing it down hard against her. She was struggling, but they were stronger. Every time she tried to pull herself up, one of them would hit her again, knocking her back down. For a split second, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. It felt like one of those slow-motion moments where your brain tries to reject reality because it doesn't fit into the normal flow of your life. Then, like a rubber band snapping back, it hit me. This was happening, right in front of me. I acted without thinking. I ran, not toward the car, not toward the men. I ran straight for the motel office. If anyone was inside, they needed to call the police. The door was unlocked, and I pushed inside, my breath already coming hard from the rush of adrenaline. The room was small, with a desk cluttered with papers, a buzzing overhead light, the smell of stale air. 2 people stood behind the counter, an older Asian man and woman, their faces unreadable as I tried to explain, tried to get the words out. There's a woman outside. She's being attacked. Call the police. But they just stared at me. Blank. Unmoving. Then, almost casually, the man shook his head. No, we are closed, he said. Closed? What the hell did that mean? Before I could argue, they shut off the lights. Just like that, the room plunged into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the streetlights filtering in through the glass door. My breath caught. They weren't going to help. For a second, I just stood there, stunned. The idea that someone would see what was happening and just turn away, close their doors, shut off their lights, pretend it wasn't happening. The reality of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I spun back toward the door and ran outside. The Cadillac was still there, but something had changed. The car was moving, slowly at first, backing out of the parking space, the alarm still screaming, the woman still struggling, half in, half out. The man in the back seat was still hitting her, his arm rising and falling, the shape of the gun in his hand unmistakable now. I could see her face for just a second as the car turned, the motel's lights casting a glow over her. Blood streaked across her cheek, eyes wild with terror. She was trying to escape, her fingers clawing at the doorframe. But they wouldn't let her go. My pulse was a hammer in my chest. I turned my head frantically, searching for anything, anyone. Then I saw it. A payphone. It was mounted to the wall of the motel, just a few feet away, facing the street. I ran toward it, my fingers shaking as I grabbed the receiver and punched in 911. The dial tone barely had time to hum before a voice picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I started talking fast, the words tumbling out, trying to explain what I was seeing. The car, the men, the woman, the gun, the motel. Then, headlights swung back toward me. The Cadillac had made a U-turn. The breath caught in my throat. They saw me. The car was coming back. For a split second, I couldn't move. I was just standing there, holding the phone, staring as the car rolled closer, the headlights beaming directly at me. Then, gunfire, The crack of the shot split the night, sharp and deafening, cutting through everything else. I felt it before I even realized what had happened. The air beside my face moving, something whizzing past me. The bullet had missed, barely, I dropped the phone and ran. There was nowhere to go, no cover, no walls, just open pavement and the cold, hard fear tearing through me. Then, sirens, Flashing red and blue lights exploded across the street. Cops. I'd never seen so many at once. Cars swarming in from every direction, screeching onto Lombard Street, doors flying open before they even stopped moving. Officers poured out, guns drawn, shouting orders, the streetlights glinting off their badges. The Cadillac jerked forward, trying to flee, but it was too late. They were surrounded. I stopped running, gasping for breath, my chest heaving, my hands trembling so hard I could barely register the feeling anymore. I turned, watching as police swarmed the car, yanking the men out, pinning them to the pavement. The woman, she was still in the back seat. An officer pulled her out, supporting her as she stumbled onto the pavement. She could barely stand, her body swaying. The gunmen were cuffed. They weren't going anywhere. I stood there, just watching, feeling everything settle in, the fear, the shock, the relief. The woman was safe. And so was I. I had always believed, or at least wanted to believe, that the system worked. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not fairly all the time, but that at the very least, if you did the right thing, you wouldn't end up on the wrong side of it. That was what I told myself before everything happened. Before I realized how quickly someone could disappear, and how easily the people in power could make it seem like it had never happened at all. I was a cop. Not a detective, not anyone with rank, just a regular officer in a big city precinct where everything moved too fast and nothing ever really changed. At first, I just kept my head down. The job wasn't about heroics, it was about surviving. I learned early on that making waves meant making enemies, and the guys who got promotions weren't the ones who asked too many questions. It was little things at first. A few reports that didn't match the facts. Arrests that were made to hit quotas. Cases that went nowhere because they were never meant to go anywhere. It wasn't my job to fix it. I told myself that every time I saw something that didn't sit right with me, it wasn't my job to fix it. But then it got worse. There was a robbery in my sector, nothing out of the ordinary. Except the suspect they picked up didn't match any of the descriptions, didn't have any of the stolen property, and hadn't even been anywhere near the store. I read the reports. I looked at the evidence. It didn't add up. But it wasn't until I heard the way my sergeant laughed about it in the locker room, bragging about cleaning up the streets, no matter who had to take the fall, that I realized what was happening. It wasn't a mistake. It was policy. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my problem. I tried to forget about it. But then it happened again, and again. And when I asked questions, I got the kind of answers that weren't answers at all, just jokes and shrugs and warnings to mind my own business. So I started writing things down, taking notes, keeping copies of reports. Then I started recording, not on my department-issued body cam. Those could be turned off. I bought my own recorder, small enough to fit in my vest. I kept it running during roll call, during briefings, during conversations where things were said that no one would ever write down. I didn't have a plan. I just knew that I had to have proof, because no one would believe me otherwise. For months, nothing happened. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just looking for something that wasn't there. Then I turned in a report, and it came back rewritten. An arrest that had been made by another officer had been reassigned to my name. The suspect, a kid barely 18, had been beaten before being booked, but now my name was attached to it. I went to my sergeant. I told him there was a mistake. He smiled at me like I was stupid. "You were there, weren't you?" he said. I wasn't, but that didn't matter. It was a test. I could sign the report and go along with it, or I could push back and see what happened. I didn't sign it. That was the beginning of the end. It started with little things. My locker was broken into, but nothing was taken. Just enough to let me know someone had been there. My schedule changed suddenly, without notice, putting me on the worst shifts with the worst assignments. Then it got worse. I went to work one day, and my patrol car wasn't in the lot. I asked the desk sergeant where it was. He smirked. "What car?" I went to my captain's office, but he wasn't in. His secretary told me there was no record of me having an assigned vehicle. I checked the logs. My name had been removed. That night, I went home and checked my mailbox. There was a letter, no return address, just a single sheet of paper with one sentence. "You don't belong here." I started carrying my gun, even when I wasn't on duty. The first RAAL warning came a week later. I was sitting in my apartment, reviewing my notes, when I heard a knock at my door. I checked the peephole. 3 guys, all in plain clothes, but I knew them. Cops from my precinct. I didn't answer. They knocked again. Louder. Then I heard a voice. "Hey man, you in there? You've been acting weird lately. We just want to talk." I stayed silent. A pause. Then a laugh. "Come on, don't be like that. We're worried about you. We got a call saying you've been acting unstable. We're just checking in." I backed away from the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up. I started to speak, but then I heard it. A phone ringing. Not mine. Outside my door. I hung up. They kept knocking for a while. Then I heard one of them say something, and the knocking stopped. I waited. Listened. No footsteps. No voices. Then I heard the sound of metal against metal. They were picking the lock. I ran to my bedroom. Locked the door. Moved my dresser in front of it. Grabbed my recorder and hid it under the floorboard, where I kept my backup. Then I heard the door open. They took their time. Walked around like they owned the place. I could hear them in my kitchen. Opening cabinets. Laughing. Then one of them knocked on my bedroom door. "Hey buddy, you in there?" I didn't answer. A sigh. "Come on man, don't make this difficult." I held my breath. Then the doorknob rattled. I had my gun in my hand. Safety off. Then another voice. "Ah, shit, look at this." A pause. Then a laugh. "Well, would you look at that? He's been recording us." Another laugh. Then footsteps. Then silence. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then, a voice, right outside the door. "You don't want to go, but I'm afraid your heart rate and blood pressure are so high, we can't in good conscience let you stay here." And then, the door burst open. ####buried. I woke up in a white room. No windows. Just a bed, a chair, and a locked door. I tried to sit up, but my arms were strapped down. A doctor came in. He smiled too much, talked too softly, told me I was being held for my own safety, that my co-workers had found me in distress, that I had been making paranoid accusations, that I was a danger to myself. I told him I was fine. He nodded like he didn't believe me. Days passed, then weeks. No phone calls, no visitors, no way out. Then, a knock at my door. A nurse. "Your father's been looking for you." My heart started pounding. And then finally, after endless days and nights, after being buried alive, forgotten, erased, the door opened, and I stepped outside, and I ran. I don't know when my voice stopped mattering. Maybe it never did. But I remember the moment I tried to use it, the moment I tried to speak, and what it cost me. The earth was still damp from the storm the night before, but the heat was already rising off the fields in thick, wavy lines. It was the kind of heat that made the world feel slow, like moving through water, like everything in you was being drained and nothing but exhaustion remained. My feet were sore, my back ached, and I had not eaten more than a handful of cornbread in 2 days. But hunger was nothing compared to grief. I had not slept since they took my husband. I had watched them drag him away. I had seen their hands on him, their faces twisted in something beyond hatred. I had heard the sound of fists and boots striking flesh, the dull thuds of bone giving way. But the worst of it was the sound he made. Not screaming, not begging, just a sound deep in his chest, like something breaking, something being crushed from the inside. And then silence. I knew what they had done. Everyone did. They had left his body hanging by the river, swinging slow in the thick air. They had left him there as a warning, but to me, it was something else. It was the proof of what I had always known but tried not to believe, that we were not safe, that we had never been safe, that no matter how hard we worked, no matter how much we tried to live our lives, no matter how much we swallowed our pride and bowed our heads, it would never be enough. Hazel was gone, and I had lost my fear. I was not stupid. I knew what they could do to me, but I also knew the feeling of Hazel's hands on mine, the way his voice sounded when he laughed, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I knew what it was to love someone and to lose them to the hands of men who had decided they were gods. And I knew that if I stayed silent, if I swallowed my anger, it would eat me alive. I spoke. I told them they were wrong. I told them Hazel had nothing to do with it. I told them that what they had done was murder, not justice. I told them I would see them punished for it. And they heard me. It started with whispers. I could feel them watching me, their eyes lingering too long when I passed. A silence would fall in the air when I stepped into a room, a waiting kind of silence, thick with unspoken words. And then came the voices, too loud, too casual. She don't know her place. That Turner woman thinks she's something special. She need a lesson. I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. It was more than anger. It was something deeper, something old and rotting, something that had been festering long before I was born. I knew I should leave, but where would I go? My child was growing inside me, heavy and real. This was my home. And besides, I did nothing wrong. That thought didn't protect me. They came for me in the night. I had been sleeping, or trying to. The baby made it hard. I could never get comfortable. My body ached, and my mind would not quiet. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of boots on dirt, the low murmur of voices, the sharp clink of metal. Then light. The door burst open, and they were on me before I could move. Hands grabbed at me, pulling, yanking me from the bed, from the house. I kicked, I fought, but there were too many of them. Their hands were rough, digging into my arms, my hair, my legs. The stars were bright above me as they dragged me outside. I remember looking up, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. It was a clear night. The moon was nearly full. It should have been beautiful, but all I could hear was the sound of their voices, thick with laughter and something worse. They called me names. I do not want to remember them. They tied my hands behind my back. Someone laughed and said something about how I ran fast for a pregnant gal. Someone else spit on me. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't say anything at all. They took me to the bridge. Folsom Bridge. I had been there before. As a child, I had stood at the edge and thrown stones into the water, watching the ripples spread out in perfect circles. Now I stood there again, and the water was still. The trees stood tall and dark, shadows against the night. The air smelled like damp earth and smoke. They forced me to my knees. My body was tired, so tired. My arms ached from being twisted behind my back. My skin was slick with sweat, but I was shaking from something colder than the night air. I could hear them moving around me, could feel the heat of their bodies standing too close. Then they turned me upside down. The blood rushed to my head, and for a moment, the world blurred at the edges. The rough rope bit into my ankles as they tied me to the tree. My stomach twisted, the weight of the baby pulling against me in a way that felt wrong, that felt unnatural. The nausea rose in my throat, thick and choking. Then came the smell of gasoline. The fire was hot. I could feel it licking at my skin, even before it touched me. The smoke filled my nose, burned my throat, stung my eyes. My body screamed for air, for relief, but there was none. Then the knife. I cannot describe the pain. I could feel everything. I could feel the blade biting deep, parting skin, slicing through me like I was nothing more than a sack of flour. I could feel the warmth of my own blood spilling out, pooling against my skin. Then the weight in my stomach was gone. I do not want to remember what happened next. But I do. The child fell. For a moment, there was silence. Then a cry. Small. Weak. A sound that should not have been possible. I could not move. I could not breathe. I could only watch. The boot came down. The sound it made was not a sound I had ever heard before, and I pray I never hear it again. There was laughter. I closed my eyes. I don't know when the bullet started. I remember the impact, the way my body jerked with each shot. I remember the sharp sting, the dull ache, the warmth of my own blood running down my skin, mixing with the dirt, with the ashes, with everything that had once been me. And then, finally, there was nothing. I was buried where I fell. They did not give me a name. They did not give me a marker. A whiskey bottle stood in the dirt above me. A joke, a reminder, a warning, but I was not the one who needed to be warned, because they were right about one thing. I did not know my place, and even now, even in death, I refused to learn it. I never used to think much about the air I breathed. It was just there, filling my lungs without effort, something I never questioned, until the day I learned how easily it could be taken away. I was working as an engineer at a semiconductor plant, one of Intel's facilities with strict cleanroom requirements. These rooms had to be airtight, sealed off from the outside world, to prevent even the smallest particle of dust from contaminating the delicate silicon wafers we produced. To maintain that level of purity, we used pressurized gases, nitrogen, argon, and a few others, to create a controlled environment. We had training for it, of course. Confined spaces training, they called it. I remember sitting in a windowless room, listening to the instructor's monotonous voice explain the dangers. He went over the physics of it all, how gases like argon and nitrogen were heavier than air, how they could settle at ground level without you even realizing it. The scenario he described stuck with me. If there's a leak in the argon tank, he had said, the gas will pool along the floor. If you bend down to pick up a dropped tool, your head could enter that oxygen-deprived layer, and before you even realize what's happening, you'll lose consciousness. You won't feel dizzy, you won't have time to react, your brain will just shut off. And then came the most chilling part. 4 out of 5 deaths happen when someone else goes in to help. They don't understand why the person is on the ground. They assume it's a medical emergency, so they rush in, and then they drop too. The room had been silent after that. The idea that you could just die, without a struggle, without gasping or choking, without even knowing it was happening, it was unsettling. At the time, I told myself it was just one of those extreme cautionary tales, the kind that companies drill into you to avoid lawsuits. I was careful, of course, but I didn't think it would ever really apply to me. Then one day it did. It started with an alarm. I was in the break room, drinking stale coffee from a styrofoam cup, when the low, pulsing womp 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 of the facility's warning system filled the air. It wasn't the fire alarm, nor the chemical spill alarm. I knew those well. This one was different. I glanced at the digital panel on the wall. Gas detected, cleanroom C4. I felt my stomach tighten. That was my sector. I dumped the coffee and grabbed my emergency mask from my locker. Every cleanroom tech had one, a compact, airtight respirator designed to give you 5 to 10 minutes of breathable air in case of a gas leak. The training drilled it into us. If there's a leak, put on your mask first. Do not rush in without it. Asterisk, asterisk. But when I stepped into the corridor, I saw someone had already ignored that rule. A man was lying face down just outside the cleanroom's airlock, half in, half out of the door. His blue jumpsuit and ID badge told me he was a fellow engineer, though I couldn't see his face. He wasn't moving. I felt a spike of adrenaline. I had 2 conflicting instincts. The first was to run to him, to grab his shoulders and pull him away from the door. The second was a quiet, logical voice reminding me of the training. 4 out of 5 deaths happen when someone tries to help. I forced myself to stop and think. I looked closer. His arm was stretched toward the doorway, fingers curled as if he had been reaching for something. His other hand was under his body. No signs of struggle, no blood. Just stillness. The cleanroom door was propped open by something. I couldn't see what from my angle. That was bad. Really bad. If there was a gas leak inside, it could be spreading into the hallway. I took a slow breath and moved carefully. Staying upright, I leaned just far enough to see inside. The first thing I noticed was that everything looked normal. No clouds of visible vapor, no hissing pipes or warning lights inside. The room was silent, the white walls and clean surfaces untouched. But there was something on the floor. Another person. They were further inside, crumpled near one of the gas tanks. Also motionless. I clenched my jaw. 2 people down. That meant whatever gas was in there was still active. Asterisk, asterisk. I adjusted my mask, making sure it had a tight seal, and double-checked the air supply. It was working. I had 5, maybe 6 minutes before it ran out. Stepping over the man in the doorway, I went inside. The silence was unnerving. In a normal cleanroom, you'd hear the hum of air filtration, the faint sound of machines running diagnostics, the soft beeping of monitors tracking environmental conditions. But now there was nothing. It felt dead. I kept my breathing steady and moved quickly toward the second person on the floor. They were lying near the argon tanks. That was a bad sign. I crouched beside them, careful not to lower my head too far. Their face was pale, eyes half open but unfocused. I pressed 2 fingers to their neck. Nothing. I swallowed hard and checked for any sign of breathing. Also nothing. I knew the truth, but I still hesitated before accepting it. They were gone. I glanced toward the control panel on the wall. The gas detectors had activated, but there was no active venting. ***, meaning the automatic system had failed. ***, that explained why the leak hadn't been stopped. I tapped my air supply gauge. 3 minutes left. I turned back toward the exit. ***, and nearly tripped over the first guy. ***. He was lying just inside the doorway now. I realized my mistake. He hadn't collapsed outside the cleanroom. He must have entered just before me. ***, I hadn't seen him move because I wasn't looking, which meant he might still be alive. I dropped to one knee and checked his vitals. His pulse was weak but there. His breathing was shallow, barely noticeable, but still going. He had seconds, maybe a minute, before he slipped past the point of no return. I hooked my arms under his shoulders and started dragging him out. By the time I reached the hallway, my air supply was almost gone. I pulled him far enough away from the door to be clear of any lingering gas and tore off my mask. Clean air flooded my lungs, sharp and cold. My vision swam for a moment, but I pushed through it. I turned the man onto his side, tilting his head back to keep his airway open. He was barely breathing, but he was breathing. That meant he had a chance. Others were running toward us now. Emergency response, medical personnel, security. Someone took over for me, checking his vitals and administering oxygen. I stood back, hands shaking. I turned to look at the cleanroom one last time. Inside, the second person was still lying there, motionless. It hit me then. I hadn't been fast enough. One man would live, but the other was already gone. If I had gotten there sooner, if I had acted quicker. I clenched my fists and forced the thought away. I had done what I could. The official report came out 2 days later. A valve on the argon tank had failed, releasing the gas in a slow but steady leak. The heavier-than-air gas had pooled along the floor, creating an invisible death trap. The first victim had been working near the tanks when he dropped something, bent down to pick it up, and never got back up. The second man, the one I had saved, had gone in to check on him. Without realizing what had happened, he kneeled down, and the gas had taken him, too. I had almost been the third. The cleanroom was shut down for weeks. New safety measures were put in place. But the truth was simple. No alarm, no flashing light, no warning sign could ever be as effective as knowing when to stop and think. I kept my respirator close after that. And I never, bent down without checking the air again. Sequoia National Park is an ancient place. The kind of place that humbles you, even when you're sober. The trees here aren't just big, they're impossible. 300, 400 feet tall. They don't just make you feel small. They make you feel irrelevant, like a fly in a cathedral built by time itself. The oldest ones have been standing since before the Egyptian pyramids were even an idea. Some have been here since before the written word. And when they die, they don't just fall. They collapse, shaking the earth, reshaping the land around them, dragging everything down with them like sinking ships pulling in the wreckage of other boats nearby. Albert and his 4 friends weren't thinking about any of that when they drove up to the park. They were thinking about the trip they were about to take, 2 tabs of acid each, under a sky so dark you could see the edge of the universe if you stared long enough. They were psychonauts, people who didn't just take psychedelics for fun but for exploration, for pushing the limits of what the human mind could comprehend. They had tripped in deserts, in mountains, in cities, and in forests, but never here. Never inside a sequoia tree that had died so long ago its rings had probably recorded the fall of the Roman Empire. The fallen giant was known among campers as Home Tree. It was a massive, hollowed-out sequoia lying on its side, wide enough that you could drive a bus through it. The inside had been cleared and somewhat maintained by rangers, so it was a livable space. On one end of the roof, there was a natural break in the wood, a gaping hole that made the place feel like a fortress with an open skylight. This was where they would set up camp. This was where they would trip. They got their fire going just beneath the hole in the tree's roof, the smoke drifting lazily into the cold night air. Flames cast wild, flickering shadows on the massive, curved walls around them, making the space feel like some kind of ancient cave. The heat bounced off the smooth interior of the tree, warming the place up fast. It felt safe, secure. They were deep in the wilderness, but inside Home Tree, surrounded by thousands of years of petrified wood, it felt like nothing could touch them. Then the acid started to hit. Albert sat on a log inside the tree, staring up through the hole above, watching the stars. The fire crackled and popped beside him, sending sparks swirling into the dark. Someone passed him a bottle of water, which he sipped slowly, the cool liquid feeling impossibly strange in his mouth. He could hear every drop as it went down his throat. The world around him had shifted. The forest outside the tree wasn't just there anymore, it was watching. The trees were old, older than any human civilization, older than any name ever given to this land. They had seen everything, and now they were watching him. Yoko, another experienced tripper, wasn't content to just sit inside the tree and stare at the stars. She wanted to go, to explore. She wanted to see what the forest was like under the influence, to push out into the blackness and let the trip take her where it wanted to go. Albert, even in his altered state, knew this was a terrible idea. They only had one flashlight between them, and the forest out there was massive. If you got lost, really lost, it didn't matter how smart you were. It didn't matter if you'd been hiking since you could walk. The trees out here swallowed people whole. He argued against it, told Yoko that there was more than enough nature inside the tree to experience. He told her that it wasn't safe. The argument looped. Again and again, back and forth, the same points being made over and over. Both of them convinced they were right. Both of them locked in a mental loop that neither could break. Finally, Albert gave up. He sat back down on his log, sighing loudly. Fine, I'll just be the boring safety guy. I'll just sit here and stare at the fire. Yoko opened her mouth to respond, but nature had already decided to settle the argument for them. The sound that came next was unlike anything Albert had ever heard in his life. A noise so large, so powerful, so completely wrong that it didn't even register as sound at first. It was a pressure wave, a shift in the air, something so fundamentally massive that his brain took a second to even understand that it was noise at all. Then the sound hit. A crack, so loud that it split the night in half. Not just one crack, but dozens, hundreds. The sound of the world tearing apart. A deep, earth-shaking groan, like something ancient waking up after thousands of years. Then a roar, a sound so deep and powerful that it felt like the entire planet was shaking. Albert's brain, still warped by the acid, struggled to make sense of what was happening. His body was already moving before his mind could catch up, scrambling toward the opening of Home Tree, looking out into the night. Nothing, just blackness. But the sound kept going. A rolling, cascading crash, a chaotic symphony of snapping wood, thunderous impacts, the deep, shuddering groan of something too big moving in a way it was never meant to move. The ground vibrated beneath their feet. The trees outside Home Tree shook. Then, silence. A silence so deep that it felt even louder than the noise before it. Albert turned back to the others, their faces pale even in the firelight. Nobody spoke. Because what the fuck could you even say? They didn't sleep that night. They couldn't. They sat around the fire, their minds spinning, trying to process what had happened. Theories were thrown out. An 18-wheeler had crashed off the highway and barreled through the woods. An earthquake had struck. Some kind of military explosion. Optimus Prime battling Decepticons. Nothing made sense. The sound had been too big, too impossible. Eventually, exhaustion won. One by one, they drifted into uneasy sleep. Albert woke up to the sound of chainsaws. Not one, dozens, maybe hundreds. He jolted awake, heart hammering, stomach twisting. Had he missed the start of it? How had the first chainsaw not woken him up? He crawled to the opening of Home Tree, peered out, and froze. The forest was gone. Not all of it. Not the standing giants. But everything else. A swath of devastation, stretching out in front of Home Tree. A path of absolute destruction carved into the woods, barely 200 feet from where they had been sitting. A sequoia, 200 years old, had finally given up. It had collapsed, tumbling 800 feet down a hill, dragging 83 other trees with it. It had missed them by nothing. The wrong gust of wind, the wrong lean, the wrong shift in the dirt, and home tree would have been crushed into nothing. Men in hard hats and orange vests swarmed the wreckage, cutting through the fallen timber with ruthless efficiency. The cleanup crews were already here. Albert could hardly believe it. Someone behind him muttered, "Holy shit." Albert let out a slow breath, then turned back toward Yoko. He didn't have to say anything, because they both knew exactly what would have happened if they had decided to go exploring. I still remember that morning clearly, even though so many years have passed. It was one of those ordinary school days, the kind where nothing seemed particularly important until everything changed. I was in 8th grade, riding the bus like I did every morning. The seats were covered in that stiff, cracked vinyl, and the air smelled faintly of sweat, cheap deodorant, and whatever breakfast someone had shoved into their backpack. The bus driver was the same grumpy old guy who barely looked at us through the wide mirror above his head. My friend sat next to me, the same way he always did. We weren't best friends, not really. But we lived near each other, and we talked enough to pass the time on the ride to school. He had this way of slumping in his seat, his head pressed against the window, half asleep until something interesting happened. He was quiet, but he laughed at my jokes, even the dumb ones, and we had that kind of easy friendship that comes from spending too much time stuck on the same bus. We were maybe halfway through the route when the gunshots rang out. 3 sharp cracks, loud even through the closed windows. The kind of sound that made everyone on the bus pause for a second, some of them ducking instinctively before realizing what they had done and trying to play it off. I turned my head, scanning the neighborhood rolling past us. At first, I didn't see anything. It was just the same old houses, the same old trees, the same cracked sidewalks leading up to porches with peeling paint. But then the sirens came. They started distant, rising and falling, the kind that made your stomach tighten even when you didn't know why. And then suddenly, police cars were flying past us. Their lights flashed in streaks of red and blue, reflecting off the windows and the metal bars of the bus seats. The driver slowed down, just slightly, enough that I could see the officers inside gripping the wheel, their faces stiff and focused. My friend sat up, frowning, his breath fogging the window as he stared out. I didn't think much of it at the time. Gunshots weren't exactly common in our neighborhood, but we had all heard them before, usually from far away. It was the kind of thing that made people talk for a few days, made parents extra strict about coming home before dark, and then eventually faded into the background of everything else. The bus kept moving. No one knew what had happened yet. It wasn't until we got to school that I started to realize something was wrong. The day began the way it always did. We shuffled off the bus, dumping our bags into lockers, moving through the usual sluggish morning routine. Homeroom was mostly quiet, the way it always was before people woke up enough to start talking. My friend sat at his desk, staring ahead, like his mind was somewhere else. And then the door opened. The principal walked in, a serious look on his face. He was one of those men who always seemed calm, even when kids were throwing desks or starting fights in the hallway. But that morning, there was something different about him. He stepped inside, scanning the room, then called my friend's name. My friend barely hesitated. He just stood up and walked toward the door. I remember the way his chair scraped against the tile floor, the sound sharp in the silence. He disappeared into the hallway, and the door shut behind him. Nobody said anything at first. We were all too busy looking at each other, trying to figure out if someone knew what was going on. It wasn't uncommon for kids to get called out, but this felt different. A few minutes later, the door opened again. My friend stepped back inside. I still remember his face. It was white. Not pale, not scared, just blank, drained, like all the color had been pulled out of him in an instant. He didn't say anything. He just walked to his desk, grabbed his backpack, and left again. He didn't come back that day. He didn't come back the next day either. In fact, I didn't see him again for 6 months. When I got home that afternoon, my mom was already sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. The news was playing, the local anchor's voice a low, serious murmur. The second I walked in, she turned to me, her face tight with something I couldn't quite place. "Did you hear what happened?" she asked. I shook my head. She turned back to the screen, but I barely needed to look. She told me everything. My friend's parents had been divorced for a while. I knew that much. His mom had a restraining order against his dad, which I didn't know. But apparently his grandfather, his dad's dad, didn't like that. That morning, after my friend and his sister had left for school, his grandfather had grabbed a shotgun and walked straight into their house. His mom didn't stand a chance. He shot her 3 times. I remember my mom telling me that one of the shots hit her hand as she raised it, trying to protect herself. The image of that stuck with me, her standing there, trying to block a shotgun blast with nothing but her palm. And then, just like that, he was gone. The old man took off into the woods behind their house. Disappeared. They never found him. For weeks, the police searched, combing through the trees, knocking on doors, questioning everyone. The entire neighborhood was on edge. My mom locked the doors twice, sometimes 3 times, before going to bed. My dad kept the porch light on all night. People whispered about it at school, at the grocery store, in hushed voices over the phone. And my friend was just gone. His mom survived barely. She was in the hospital for months. My friend and his sister went to live with relatives, which was why I didn't see him for so long. By the time he came back to school, everything had changed. He was quieter. Before, he had always been the type to laugh at my jokes, to nod along when I talked, to at least seem like he was paying attention. But now he barely spoke. His eyes looked older, heavier, like he had seen something none of us could understand. People whispered about him. They stared when he walked down the halls. No one said anything to his face, but I knew they were thinking about it, about the thing that had happened to him, to his family. I never asked him about it. I wanted to, but I didn't know how, and he never brought it up. We kept sitting next to each other on the bus, but it wasn't the same. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring out the window, his breath fogging up the glass, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. I wondered if he was thinking about that morning, about how normal everything had seemed, right up until the moment it wasn't. I wondered if he thought about the gunshots, about the police cars, about the fact that his grandfather had vanished into the woods and never come back. And I wondered if he ever really felt safe again. I don't know where he is now. We lost touch after high school. People move on, go to different places, start different lives. But sometimes late at night, I still think about him. I think about the way his chair scraped against the floor when he stood up that morning. I think about the police cars, the news reports, the grainy black and white photos of his grandfather on the FBI's most wanted list. I think about how, for 6 months, my friend disappeared. And I wonder if, in some way, he never really came back. I woke up to the sound of something clattering on the other side of the wall. It wasn't loud, just enough to stir me, enough to pull me out of whatever thick, heavy fog had settled over my brain. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt thick, and when I swallowed, it was like my throat was made of sandpaper. I smacked my lips and tried to open my eyes. Everything felt off. The air smelled wrong, stale like sweat and old beer. The sheets beneath me weren't mine. They were rough against my skin, and the weight of the blanket over my body felt oppressive. I shifted slightly, and a dull ache ran through my limbs, like my muscles were slow to wake up, like my body was lagging behind my brain. That was the first moment I felt it, the unease. I blinked up at the ceiling, trying to get my bearings. A ceiling fan wobbled overhead, clicking with each slow rotation. The walls were bare, off-white, the kind of color cheap apartment landlords use when they can't be bothered to pick anything else. The room was dimly lit, a soft orange glow seeping in from a window covered with thin blinds. Streetlights, maybe? I frowned. This wasn't my room. I turned my head. A nightstand. A plastic cup with water beads forming on the outside. My phone wasn't there. My heart rate picked up. I slowly pushed myself upright. The blanket fell from my shoulders, and cold air rushed over my skin. I was still in my clothes from the night before, tight jeans, my crop top, my boots. But something was missing. My jacket, my purse, my keys. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something was very, very wrong. The last thing I remembered was being at the bar. I closed my eyes, trying to piece it together. I had been with my friends. We had been drinking, laughing. I remembered ordering a vodka soda. I remembered turning away from the bar with it in my hand. But after that, it was like my memory had been cut into pieces, chunks missing, only fragments left behind. I had danced. Had I danced? I remembered lights, music, my body moving. I had been separated from my friends. I remembered feeling dizzy, leaning against the wall in the hallway by the bathrooms, trying to get my head to stop spinning. I had texted someone. Who? My stomach twisted. I had blacked out. I never blacked out. Panic started to rise in my chest. My breath came faster, my hands shaking as I reached up and pressed my fingers against my temples. Think. I had been drugged. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. I shot a look around the room, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body still felt sluggish, but my brain was waking up fast, and with it came an overwhelming rush of adrenaline. I needed to leave. Just as I threw the blanket off completely, the door opened. A man stepped inside. I froze. He had a glass of water in one hand, his other hand resting against the doorframe. He was taller than me, lean but broad-shouldered, with messy dark hair and a beard that looked like he had been letting it grow for a few weeks. He was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, the kind of thing a guy wears when he's not expecting company. His expression changed the second he saw me sitting up. Shocked, like he hadn't expected me to be awake yet, like he had planned for me to still be unconscious. I saw it all play out across his face in less than a second. The surprise, the confusion, the flicker of realization as it dawned on him that I wasn't supposed to be awake yet. And then, just as fast, something else. Calculation. His grip on the glass tightened. His shoulders squared. He thought he could still handle this. He thought he could still control me. Something deep inside me snapped into place. All my grogginess, all my confusion, all my fear, it fell away. I had trained for this. He took a step toward me, and I moved without thinking. My body reacted before my mind had fully processed it, muscle memory taking over. I lunged forward, grabbing the glass out of his hand and throwing the water directly into his face. He flinched, startled, and that half second of distraction was all I needed. I swung. My elbow connected with his jaw, snapping his head to the side. He stumbled, cursing, and I was already moving, already on him. I dropped low and drove my fist into his ribs. The breath left his lungs in a sharp gasp, and I followed it up with a knee to his stomach. He doubled over, and I grabbed the back of his head, slamming it into my rising knee. The impact sent him crashing to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he was still conscious. I turned and ran. The apartment was small. I darted out into the hallway, my boots slamming against the floor. My heart was pounding, my breath ragged. I scanned frantically. Front door. Where was the front door? There. I ran for it. The lock was stiff, but I wrenched it open with both hands and threw myself outside. Cold air hit me like a slap. I was in a stairwell, dimly lit, smelling of cigarettes and mildew. I didn't stop. I flew down the stairs, skipping steps, my legs trembling beneath me. My body still wasn't fully recovered, my limbs heavy, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. When I burst out onto the street, I sucked in a lungful of night air. I had no idea where I was. The street was quiet, a few parked cars lining the curb, a neon sign flickering at the end of the block. A 24-hour convenience store. I ran toward it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hit the numbers right as I punched my friend's number into my phone. The second she picked up, I heard her voice, panicked, yelling my name. They had been looking for me. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak, but I managed to tell them where I was. They found me 10 minutes later. By then, I was sitting on the curb outside the store, hugging my arms around my knees. I was cold, but I hadn't even noticed until my friend's arms wrapped around me, their warmth sinking into my skin. They took me to the hospital. I sat under bright white lights while a nurse took my blood, running tests. I tested positive for a date rape drug. The doctor told me I hadn't been given a high enough dose to keep me out all night. Either that, or my body had metabolized it faster than expected. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I got away. What mattered was that I fought back. I was lucky, but it wasn't just luck. It was training. It was instinct. It was the fact that I knew, in that moment, that I was not going to let that man do whatever he had planned. I had walked into that bar with my friends, thinking it was just another night out. I never thought it would happen to me, but it did. It can happen to anyone. I had been working nights as a tow truck driver for nearly 10 years when the call came in. It was early morning, just after 3 a.m., the dead stretch of time when the world feels the most empty. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of how alone you really are. I was used to it. After a decade of cleaning up wrecks, picking up drunks, and dragging totaled vehicles off the road, not much rattled me anymore. I had seen everything: twisted metal, bodies that didn't look human anymore, blood smeared across pavement in a way that didn't wash off, not really. Something stuck with you, but I had learned how to push them down, keep moving. It was just part of the job. That night had been wet, the roads slick from a full week of rain. I had just finished hooking up an abandoned sedan outside of town when my radio crackled to life. Another call coming in. Dispatch gave me the location, a stretch of road I knew well, one of those winding back highways where people think they can go as fast as they want. I sighed, turned my truck around, and started heading that way. The road was nearly empty at that hour. Just me, my headlights, and the steady sound of rain against the windshield. I had about 10 minutes left before I reached the call when I noticed a set of headlights coming up behind me, fast. Too fast. The car, a Corvette, was tearing up the road like it was the middle of the afternoon, not pitch black on a wet highway. I kept my speed steady, watching as the headlights grew brighter in my mirror. I could tell he was going to try to pass me, which was a bad idea. Up ahead was a sharp, blind turn, the kind that sneaks up on you, even if you've driven it 100 times. I flicked my high beams to try and warn him. He didn't slow down. The car veered into the opposite lane, engine roaring as it tried to overtake me. I remember gripping the wheel, stomach tightening as I watched. There was no way he was going to make that turn, and he didn't. The moment he tried to correct, the tires lost traction. The Corvette hydroplaned, skidding sideways before catching at the worst possible moment. The back end whipped around. I barely had time to react before the car left the road completely. I saw everything happen in a flash. The way the car went airborne for a second before it hit a streetlight, wrapping around it like it was made of paper. The windshield shattering into 1,000 shards of glass. And the driver, flung forward, body flying through the air like a rag doll. He hit the ground at least 20 feet from where his car came to a stop. Everything inside me went cold. I slammed on my brakes, throwing my truck into park before jumping out. My boots hit wet pavement as I sprinted toward the wreck. The smell of burning rubber and something chemical filled the air, leaking fluids, maybe coolant. The car was a ruin, the kind of wreck that usually meant no one walked away. Then I saw him. He was moving. Not much, just shifting slightly, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees in the wet grass. I picked up my pace. He was alive. Jesus Christ, he was actually alive. My boots slipped in the mud as I reached him. Hey, don't move. Just stay still. The words came out automatically, my brain already running through what I needed to do. If he had a spinal injury, moving could kill him. He needed to stay put until EMS got here. Then I saw what he was doing. His hands were clawing at the ground beneath him, frantically scraping through the dirt. For half a second, I didn't understand. Then my stomach turned inside out. In the darkness, I hadn't seen it before, but now, standing right over him, it was impossible to miss. His stomach was open. A deep, ragged gash split him from just below his ribs to his lower abdomen. Not just a cut, a rupture. Something that shouldn't have been possible, except he had gone straight through his windshield at over 100 miles an hour. And now, he was trying to scoop his insides back into his body. My mind stalled out. I had seen bad wrecks. I had seen people barely hanging on, bones sticking out at odd angles, faces shattered, blood everywhere. But this was something else. The kid was working in a blind panic, his fingers digging into the mess of himself, trying to push what should have stayed inside him back under his skin. His breathing was ragged, wheezing. Rain pattered against his back, mixing with the blood pooling beneath him. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to tell him it was going to be okay. But it wasn't. Nothing was going to be okay. He wasn't going to make it. I don't know how long I stood there. Probably only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Long enough for the shock to wear off, for the smell to hit me, the sharp, coppery tang of blood mixed with something worse, something I had never smelled before but instantly understood. I forced myself to move. I had to do something. My hands fumbled for my radio, my fingers slipping over the buttons as I called it in. I rattled off the location, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear it shaking. The dispatcher told me help was on the way. I already knew it wouldn't be fast enough. When I looked back down, his movements were slowing. His arms were trembling. His breath came in shallow gasps. He tried again, weakly, to gather himself back together, but his hands barely lifted off the ground before they collapsed beneath him. I knelt next to him, not knowing what the hell I was supposed to do. My training hadn't covered this. His head lolled to the side, and for the first time I really saw his face. He was just a kid, 20, maybe 21. His mouth moved slightly, like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. His body shuddered once, twice, then went completely still. I don't know how long I stayed there. The rain kept falling. My knees were soaked through with blood and mud. I couldn't make myself move. By the time EMS arrived, I already knew what they were going to say. There was nothing they could have done. No one could have survived that, not really. It didn't matter. I quit my job that night. I didn't think about it, didn't second guess it. I just knew I was done. I had seen a lot of things in my 10 years on the job. A lot of bad wrecks, a lot of broken bodies. I had told myself it didn't bother me, that it was just part of the work. But I never saw anything like that before. And I never wanted to again. For years afterward, I would wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the way he had been on his hands and knees, desperately trying to hold himself together. The way his fingers clawed at the ground, not understanding that it was already too late. I still think about him, about how fast he was going, about how he must have felt invincible right up until the moment he wasn't, about how young he was. I don't know his name. I never looked it up. I just hope that, wherever he is now, he finally got to rest. I had never been the type to ignore someone in need. It wasn't how I was raised. My grandfather was the same way, kind to a fault, generous, and willing to give the shirt off his back if someone needed it. Maybe that's why the whole thing still lingers in my mind, why I keep replaying it over and over. It could have gone differently. It could have gone worse. But the scariest part is that it almost didn't feel like a big deal at the time. It was just a simple act of kindness, a favor for a stranger. It started in Lake Charles, Louisiana. My grandpa had traveled there to visit family, just a short stay at a hotel for a few days before heading home. The place was nothing fancy, just one of those chain hotels off the highway, the kind with a small outdoor pool, the kind where the front desk staff always seem a little too busy to care about much. I don't think my grandpa cared much about the place itself. He was just there for family. One evening, he was outside near the pool, enjoying the humid Louisiana air, probably lost in his own thoughts, when a young guy approached him. He was polite, not pushy or aggressive, just a guy who looked a little down on his luck. He asked if my grandpa had $20 to spare for gas, said he was trying to get to New Orleans. My grandpa, being the man he was, didn't hesitate to offer help. But he wasn't naive either. Instead of just handing over the cash, he went to the front desk first. He wanted to be sure this guy wasn't skipping out on a hotel bill or pulling some kind of scam. He didn't mention that to the guy, of course, just excused himself for a moment and asked the receptionist if they knew anything about him. The front desk told him no, he wasn't trying to skip town or anything like that. The only issue was that he'd smoked in his room, and they had charged him a fee for it. That seemed harmless enough. Plenty of people ignore the no-smoking rules in hotels. My grandpa thanked them, went back to his room to grab his wallet, and then told the guy he'd go ahead and fill up his tank. There was a gas station not too far from the hotel. My grandpa drove, the guy followed behind in his car. He remembers the whole thing feeling normal, maybe a little strange, but nothing that set off any alarms. The guy was quiet, respectful, even thanked him a few times. But then, as the gas pump clicked off, the guy did something unexpected. He reached into his car, pulled something out, and turned back toward my grandpa. In his hand was a handgun. My grandpa didn't flinch, didn't panic. The guy wasn't pointing it at him. Instead, he held it out, offering it as if it were nothing more than an extra jacket or a pack of cigarettes. "You want this?" he asked. My grandpa didn't know much about guns. He didn't have a use for one, didn't want one, and politely turned the offer down. He figured maybe the guy was desperate. Maybe he was short on money and willing to barter. It was weird, definitely, but not unheard of. The guy didn't push it. He shrugged, put the gun away, thanked my grandpa again, and got in his car. My grandpa drove back to the hotel and didn't think much more about it. A couple of days passed. Then the call came. It was a Lake Charles detective. They asked if my grandpa had spoken with a man at the hotel, giving the guy's real name. My grandpa confirmed that he had, and the detective didn't hesitate to tell him why they were calling. The man had just killed 5 people in Lake Charles. 5 people. My grandpa felt his stomach drop. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but hearing that, the weight of it, was something else. The detective asked where the man had said he was going. My grandpa told them, New Orleans. They thanked him and said they'd be in touch if they needed anything else. The next day, the news broke that the man had been found in Baton Rouge. He hadn't just quietly gone on his way. He had taken a group of college students hostage inside a car, held them there for hours while police surrounded him. A standoff. He was armed, probably with the same gun he had tried to give my grandpa. At some point, he let the hostages go. The situation ended without more deaths, but it could have been so much worse. It's hard not to think about that night at the gas station. What if my grandpa had accepted the gun? What if the guy had panicked and done something then and there? What if he had already killed those people before asking for gas? What if my grandpa had refused to help him? There's no way to know what went through the man's mind. No way to know if my grandpa's kindness had somehow helped prevent something worse. But the reality is unsettling. Because for 2 days, my grandpa had gone about his life, completely unaware that he had met, spoken with, and helped a man who had slaughtered 5 people. And the scariest part? The guy had been completely normal. Not angry, not twitchy, not aggressive. Just a young man asking for a little help. I was 12 this summer. I spent nearly every weekend at my friend's house. His backyard felt like a second home, familiar, comfortable, and just far enough from town to make the nights feel quiet in a way that was both peaceful and eerie. His family had a big pit bull named Rex, a strong, muscular dog with a deep chest and wide shoulders, but with the sweetest personality to those he trusted. Rex had always liked me, and I loved that dog like he was my own. Whenever I stayed over, he'd follow me around, sticking close like a shadow. That night, we had planned to camp out in the backyard. My friend had a tent of his own, but I wanted my own space, so I set up a small one right beside his. His backyard wasn't huge, but it was fenced in, a 3-foot-high chain-link barrier that was meant more to keep Rex from running off than to keep anything out. Beyond the fence was a quiet street, and behind that, just darkness, open fields leading to a sparse tree line in the distance. It wasn't the deep woods, but it was just secluded enough that, at night, it could feel like you were far from civilization. I left the flap of my tent open that night. It was warm out, and more importantly, I wanted Rex to be able to come and go as he pleased. He had a habit of circling the yard before settling down, and I liked the idea of him curling up beside me once he was ready to sleep. At around 11, I started to wind down. I pulled my blanket over me, adjusted my pillow, and lay back, listening to the faint sounds of crickets beyond the fence. In the distance, a dog barked, some neighbor's pet responding to something I couldn't hear. Then silence. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, Rex was pressing his body against mine, settling into the tent beside me. His warmth was comforting, and I barely registered his presence before I drifted off again. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was Rex. He was growling, low, deep, and steady. I was groggy, my mind slow to catch up, but the sound of Rex's growl sent a chill through me. He wasn't playing. This wasn't the kind of half-hearted noise he made when someone walked by the fence during the day. This was a warning. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dim light filtering into my tent from the back porch of the house. My heartbeat picked up as I turned my head to see where he was looking. And then I saw him. A man, standing just outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. His face was covered by a clown mask, the cheap rubbery kind you'd see in a dollar store around Halloween. The features were exaggerated, wide, painted lips stretched into a grin, dark, hollow eye sockets staring straight at me. In his hand, he held a knife. My body locked up. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. Then Rex lunged. It happened so fast I barely registered it. 1 second, he was beside me, tense and growling. The next, he was flying out of the tent like a missile. He hit the man full force, his weight slamming into him so hard that the guy staggered back. I heard a yell, a short, startled cry, before they hit the ground. Rex didn't hesitate. He went for the arm holding the knife. I heard a wet, tearing sound, followed by another scream. The man thrashed, trying to push Rex off, but the dog was relentless. He clamped his jaws down, shaking his head violently. The knife fell from the man's grip, landing somewhere in the grass. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my body finally catching up with what was happening. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might explode. Then I screamed. The noise must have carried, because lights flicked on inside the house. A window slammed open. I barely registered the sound of footsteps, heavy and fast, thudding across the wooden deck. My friend's dad. He burst out of the house, his pistol in his hand. He didn't hesitate. "Rex, off." His voice was sharp, commanding. Rex hesitated, teeth still bared, before finally releasing his grip. The man on the ground let out a shaky, pained gasp, clutching his bleeding arm. My friend's dad kept the gun trained on him as he grabbed his phone and called 911. I stood frozen, my entire body trembling as the adrenaline coursed through me. Everything after that blurred together. The police arrived fast. They took the man away in cuffs, his arm wrapped in a bloody towel. One of the officers talked to me, asking if I was okay, but I barely registered the words. My mind kept circling back to the same thought, over and over. If it weren't for Rex. Later, we found out who the man was. He had a warrant out for his arrest. 3 sex offenses. I don't let myself think about what could have happened if Rex hadn't been there. If I had zipped up the tent. If I had been alone. That was the last time I ever camped in a backyard. I don't know if I had ever been more excited for a football match in my life. Liverpool in an FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest. A massive match at Hillsborough Stadium. It was my first time attending a semi-final, and the whole city had been buzzing for days. The anticipation in the air was electric. I had been following Liverpool since I was a child, and now, as a young man in my early 20s, I finally had the chance to be a part of something special, something historic. The plan had been simple. My mates and I were going to meet at the pub early, grab a few pints, then head to the stadium with plenty of time to spare. The match was set for 3 p.m., and we wanted to be in our places well before kickoff. The atmosphere outside the stadium was already building, red shirts everywhere, people chanting, scarves held high. It was a proper football day, the kind you never forget. But Hillsborough had always been tricky when it came to crowd control. The Leppings Lane end, where the Liverpool fans were, had always felt cramped, and I knew from past experience that getting into the standing terraces could be a bit of a squeeze. Still, we were used to it. We were used to the tight spaces, the pushing and shoving, the fight to get a good spot. It was all part of the experience. I had no idea that by the end of the day, 96 people would be dead. The turnstiles at Leppings Lane were already overwhelmed when we got there. It was about 2:30 p.m., half an hour before kickoff, and there were thousands of fans trying to get in. The entrance was narrow, with only a handful of turnstiles to let in thousands of people. The crush had already started. I had been in big crowds before. It wasn't unusual to be shoulder to shoulder with strangers, packed in so tightly you could barely move. But this felt different. There was no space, no gaps, just a wall of bodies all pushing forward. My feet barely touched the ground at times as the momentum of the crowd carried me forward. You could feel the frustration in the air. People were anxious. The match was starting soon, and we were still outside. Then, someone made the decision to open an exit gate. At first, it felt like a relief. The bottleneck of turnstiles had been impossible, but now there was space to move forward. A flood of fans entered the stadium all at once, pouring through the gate, eager to get inside. I was among them. I didn't think twice about it. None of us did. We just wanted to see the match. Inside the stadium, the standing terraces were divided into pens by metal fences. The idea was to prevent overcrowding, but the problem was that no one was directing fans where to go. There were empty sections, but we didn't know that. All we knew was that everyone was heading straight into the central pens behind the goal, the ones with the best view. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. There was no room, no space to move, no space to breathe. People kept pouring in behind us, pushing us forward, but there was nowhere to go. My body was pressed up against the people around me, the smell of sweat and beer thick in the air. I turned my head, trying to get a breath of fresh air, but all I could see were faces. Faces twisted in discomfort, confusion, then fear. I tried to shift my weight, to find a little room to adjust, but there was nothing. My arms were pinned to my sides. My chest was being squeezed from all angles. The crowd swayed, and with it, my body was carried helplessly. My feet barely touched the ground. Then the pushing started. From behind, a wave of pressure surged forward. I don't know what caused it, but it was like being hit by a wall. My ribs compressed. The breath was forced out of my lungs. People around me screamed, not in excitement but in panic. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was pain, then another push. I could hear metal creaking, the barriers at the front of the pen groaning under the weight of thousands of bodies. The fence loomed ahead, unbreakable, immovable. The people at the front had nowhere to go. They were trapped, crushed against the unyielding metal. I tried to brace myself, to push back, to find some relief, but it was impossible. My body wasn't my own anymore. It belonged to the crowd. My chest ached, my lungs screamed for air. Then I heard something I will never forget. A man's voice, desperate, pleading. I can't breathe. It was barely a whisper at first, but then more voices joined in. A chorus of fear. Help me. I can't breathe. Then suddenly the match began. It was surreal. The whistle blew, and the match started, but we were dying. People were screaming, but the noise of the crowd drowned them out. From the pitch, it must have looked like just another rowdy football crowd. No one realized what was happening. The pressure got worse. I could hear bones cracking. People were gasping, choking, clawing at the air. The metal barriers at the front of the pen bent under the weight, but they didn't break. There was nowhere to go. I saw people collapse, their bodies vanishing beneath the crowd, but there was no room for them to fall. They were held upright by the crush, their heads lolling forward, their faces pale. I realized with horror that some of them were already dead, and the game was still going on. I wanted to scream, to beg for someone to notice, to stop the match, but I could barely breathe. My vision blurred. My legs trembled. My own body was failing. Then finally someone saw. The referee stopped the game. People on the pitch began to realize something was wrong. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Bodies were being lifted over the fences, laid on the pitch. Some of them moved. Some of them didn't. I saw fans trying desperately to revive their friends, pounding on their chests, breathing into their mouths. The police were slow to react. Some of them still thought it was hooliganism, that we had caused this ourselves. I saw them forming lines, blocking the pitch, stopping fans from escaping. They didn't understand. They didn't help. I don't know how I got out. Somewhere in the chaos, I felt the pressure ease just enough. I don't remember climbing over the fence, but suddenly, I was on the pitch, gasping for breath, my legs shaking. Around me, people were crying, screaming, searching for their friends. I turned back toward the stands and saw the dead. They were still pressed against the fence, their faces lifeless, their bodies tangled together. I don't remember much after that. Just flashing lights. Sirens. The sound of grief, of pain, of a stadium that had become a graveyard. 96 people died that day. 96 fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. I survived, but part of me didn't. I don't go to matches anymore. I can't stand big crowds. Sometimes at night, I wake up gasping for air, feeling the press of bodies around me, hearing the whispers of those who didn't make it. They called it a disaster. But it wasn't an accident. It was negligence. It was failure. It was 96 lives lost because of decisions that should have never been made. And I will never forget. I don't go to bars much anymore. The thought of stepping into one, hearing the hum of chatter, the clinking of glasses, the occasional loud bang of a bottle dropping on the floor, it all makes my stomach tighten. It's been almost 40 years, and I still can't shake the way that night made me feel. The way it changed me. The way it nearly killed me. I was 18 at the time. Young, reckless, just old enough to get into places I probably shouldn't have been. I had a few friends who knew about this private club, a bar where you needed to know the right people to get in. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, dimly lit place with a pool table in the back, a jukebox that skipped half the time, and regulars who always sat at the same spots like they owned them. It was the kind of place that smelled like old beer and cigarette smoke, no matter how many times they wiped the counters down. I wasn't a regular there, but I'd been a few times. That night, I had just stepped in, nodding at the bartender, moving through the familiar haze of smoke and music. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted a drink, maybe a game of pool, just something to do. The place was crowded but not packed, just enough people to make it feel lively. A few guys were louder than the rest, drunk, slurring, laughing too hard at their own jokes. I noticed them but didn't pay much attention. Guys like that were always around. At some point, things got heated. I didn't see what started it, maybe a spilled drink, Maybe someone said the wrong thing. But the noise shifted. Chairs scraped the floor, voices got sharper, and then the bouncer stepped in. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, built like someone who had broken up 100 fights before and wasn't afraid to do it again. He grabbed two of the loudest guys by their collars, dragging them toward the front door. They resisted, swearing, stumbling, but he was stronger. The door swung open, and with one final shove, they were thrown outside. The place settled after that, the way bars do. People muttered, shook their heads, went back to their drinks. The jukebox was playing again, someone cracked a joke, and the moment passed. I was standing by the back door, letting the cool night air cut through the thick heat of the bar. Then, the front doorbell rang. I didn't turn at first. It wasn't my problem. The bouncer was still up front, and if those guys were trying to come back in, he wasn't going to let them. I heard his voice firm, telling them no. Then their voices, louder this time, more aggressive. I tensed a little, but told myself it wasn't my problem. Guys got thrown out of bars all the time. They'd yell, make a scene, and eventually leave. It happened. Then everything exploded. The sound ripped through the building, a deafening crack followed by a shockwave that made my ears ring and my vision blur. I felt something slam into my side, my shoulder, my legs. My knees buckled, and for a second, I didn't understand what had happened. Screams, glass shattering, the smell of smoke and something else, something sharp and bitter that I couldn't place. The air was thick with dust and debris, floating like fog in the dim light. I forced myself up, disoriented, heart slamming against my ribs. My ears were still ringing, drowning out everything else. My head was pounding. Something was wrong. Something was horribly wrong. Then I saw her, the girl who had been sitting by the door. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't moving. She was just staring at her hands, at her arms, her jacket. The leather was torn, shredded, and her skin was punctured by thick splinters, jagged pieces of wood that jutted out like broken bones. Some of them had gone straight through, piercing her hand like needles. Blood dripped in thin, dark lines onto the floor, mixing with the dust and glass. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my brain stuck in a loop of confusion and panic. Then the bartender shouted something. I couldn't make it out, but the urgency in his voice broke through my shock. People were dropping to the ground, scrambling for cover. I ran. I don't even remember making the decision. My body just moved. I dove behind the pool table, curling in on myself, arms over my head. My breathing was ragged, shallow. I could feel the wood pressed against my back, could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears like a drum. My hands were shaking so hard I thought I might lose control of them completely. I stayed there, wedged between the table and the floor, too afraid to move. The dust in the air made my throat burn, made it hard to breathe. I had no idea what was happening. The only thing I knew was that I wasn't safe. Time stretched, twisting, warping. I don't know how long I stayed like that, seconds, minutes, hours. It didn't matter. Then the sirens. The flashing red and blue lights spilled in through the broken doorway, painting everything in violent, shifting colors. The sounds of voices, sharp commands, boots against the floor. Someone touched my shoulder, and I flinched so hard I almost hit my head against the table. I looked up, blinking through the dust. A cop. His face was blurred, distorted, but I could make out his uniform, the badge. It was over. The guys who had been thrown out earlier had stolen quarter sticks of dynamite. They had come back angry, wanting revenge. They hadn't cared who they hurt, hadn't cared about the girl who had been sitting too close, hadn't cared about the people inside. They had just wanted to make a statement. And they had. I don't remember much after that. The cops took statements. People were taken to the hospital. I was scraped up, bruised, but nothing serious. Others weren't so lucky. The girl by the door survived, but I don't know what happened to her after that. I never saw her again, but the damage was done. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that bar, back behind that pool table, back in the moment when the explosion hit and my body froze in pure terror. Every loud noise made me jump. Car backfires, fireworks, anything. It all sent me straight back to that night. Even now, almost 40 years later, I still react. If something falls suddenly, if a door slams too hard, if I hear anything that sounds even remotely like that explosion, I hit the floor before I even think. My body still remembers, even when my mind tries to forget. People talk about PTSD like it's just something soldiers get, like it's something that only happens in war zones. But it doesn't take a battlefield to break you. Sometimes all it takes is one night in a bar, one explosion, one moment where everything changes. I was 18 then. I'm 57 now. And I never forgot. I never will. My ex-wife had always been the type to jump on a good deal. She had an eye for it, especially when it came to houses. We were living in a cramped apartment at the time, and she was relentless in her search for something bigger, something we could call our own. One day, she called me, excited about a house she had found. "It's a steal," she said, "way under market value. I want you to see it today." I wasn't planning to leave work early, but she insisted. It wasn't far, and I figured if it was really that good of a deal, it was worth a look. So, I mentioned it to a couple of coworkers before heading out, casually dropping the address. That was when one of them asked, "That isn't the murder house, is it?" I froze. I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked a few more questions, and she seemed reluctant to explain, like she didn't want to be the one to tell me. So I pulled out my phone, typed in the address, and did some quick searching. The story was horrific. A young mother, home alone with her 2 toddlers, had put out an ad online. She was giving away baby items, strollers, clothes, toys, to anyone in need. Another woman had responded. She arrived at the house, was let in, then pulled a gun and shot the mother in the head. She took the children and disappeared. I reread the details twice. It didn't happen in the house we were looking at, but in the house next door. I debated whether to even tell my wife before meeting her there. I didn't want to sway her opinion before she saw the house. Maybe the story was just a terrible coincidence. People moved on, houses changed hands, neighborhoods recovered. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. But when I pulled into the neighborhood, something felt wrong. It was a quiet street, lined with single-story houses, the kind built in the late 70s or early 80s. Lawns were patchy, some overgrown, others neatly kept. A few houses had for sale signs out front, their prices slashed lower and lower in red marker. I parked in front of the house we were supposed to see. It looked fine, normal. Beige siding, dark shutters, a clean driveway. A good-sized yard. Nothing about it should have set off alarms. But my eyes kept drifting next door. The house where it had happened. It looked the same as the pictures from the news articles. Same pale blue siding, same small front porch. The windows were dark. The lawn hadn't been cut in weeks, maybe months. A mailbox leaned at an angle, as if someone had backed into it and never bothered to fix it. My wife pulled up beside me and stepped out of her car, beaming. I could already tell she loved the place. I followed her inside. The house smelled like fresh paint, new carpets. Someone had tried to make it feel new again. The rooms were bigger than I expected. The kitchen had been updated, and there was a backyard with a tall wooden fence. She started listing all the reasons why it was perfect. I nodded along, but I kept thinking about next door. Through the kitchen window, I could see the backyard of the other house. There was an old wooden swing set, one of those cheap ones you get at Walmart. Rust lined the chains, and the plastic seat was faded and warped from years of sun. It moved slightly in the wind. I knew we weren't in the crime scene house. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. We walked through the rest of the house. I tried to see it through her eyes, the potential, the savings, the smart financial decision. But every time I looked outside, my stomach tightened. When we stepped back onto the front porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man was standing on the sidewalk, staring at the murder house. He was in his 50s, maybe older. Gray hair, thin frame. He didn't move, didn't glance at us. He just stood there, looking at the house, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I wanted to ignore him. Maybe he was just a neighbor. Maybe he was just remembering. But then he turned and looked right at me. His eyes were hollow, his face unreadable. Then he walked away. My wife was still talking, excited about the deal, about how we could make the house our own. She hadn't noticed him. I didn't say anything. We got in our cars and drove home. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. I couldn't stop picturing that man. Who was he? A relative of the victim? Someone who had known the family? A neighbor who had lived here long before it happened? I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just my imagination running wild. But the next morning, I went back. I didn't tell my wife. I just got in my car and drove to the house. The street was empty. The neighborhood was silent. But the man was there again, standing in the exact same spot, staring at the house. And I knew in that moment that he had never stopped coming back. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he had a reason, but I didn't care. I didn't want to live here. I didn't want to wake up every morning knowing what had happened next door. I didn't want to lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the past ever really lets go of a place. When my wife asked me later what I thought of the house, I didn't even hesitate. Hard pass. She didn't argue. Neither of us ever brought it up again. I never used to think much about road accidents. You hear about them all the time. Someone speeding, someone drinking, someone losing control. You see the news reports, you hear the stories, you feel bad for a moment, and then you go on with your life. Until it happens close to you. Until you see it. Until you stand in a hospital hallway, watching a family fall apart in real time. Then it never leaves you. I live in a rural area. People here drink, and they drive. It's stupid, reckless, and dangerous, but it happens more than anyone wants to admit. The back roads are quiet, cops don't patrol often, and most of the time, people get away with it. But not always. There were 3 guys around here, all about 19 or 20 years old. 2 of them were first cousins, practically brothers. They grew up together, did everything together. The 3rd guy was just as much a part of their lives, a close friend, always around, always part of whatever they were doing. That night, they had been out drinking in town, nothing unusual. At some point, the 2 cousins decided to head back early. They were staying at a friend's house, about 10 minutes out of town. For some reason, whether it was a phone call, a text, or just a drunken decision, they agreed to drive back toward town to pick up their friend. They knew they couldn't drive into the actual town center, not with alcohol in their system, so they chose a quiet, rural spot near the outskirts where they wouldn't run into any cops. On the way down, one of them posted a Snapchat video. You could hear the music blaring. No seatbelts. The driver had a beer in one hand, a cigarette in the other. They were laughing, messing around, thinking they were invincible. The video only lasted a few seconds, but that was the last footage of them alive. They picked up their friend and turned back toward home. The driver was speeding. Not just a little over the limit, reckless, pedal to the floor kind of speeding. It wasn't a long drive, just 10 minutes back to their friend's house, but those 10 minutes never ended. At some point, the driver lost control. Maybe the alcohol slowed his reflexes. Maybe he overcorrected on a curve. Maybe he just wasn't paying attention for half a second. Whatever it was, it sent them straight into a concrete wall. The guy in the passenger seat took the worst of it. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and the force of the crash sent him straight through the windshield. He died on impact. There was nothing anyone could have done for him. The driver survived the initial crash, but just barely. When paramedics arrived, he was unresponsive. They managed to resuscitate him at the scene, but the damage was done. His brain was gone. The 3rd guy, the one in the back seat, was somehow still alive. Unconscious but breathing. They rushed all 3 of them to the hospital. The injuries were catastrophic. The driver had severe brain damage. The doctors kept him on life support, but the tests showed no activity. He was brain dead. The guy in the back seat had a massive brain bleed. The doctors weren't even sure how bad it was because the swelling made it impossible to assess the full extent of the damage. They told his family to prepare for the worst. If he survived, they said, he would probably be in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. I went to the hospital that night. I wasn't family, but I was close enough to know all of them. The ICU waiting room was packed. 3 families, all grieving in different ways. One family had already lost their son. He was gone, nothing left to do but wait for his body to be released. The other family had lost their son, too. They just hadn't taken him off life support yet. They were waiting, trying to come to terms with the fact that he was never waking up. And then there was the 3rd family, the only one still holding onto a sliver of hope. But it was a fragile, painful kind of hope. They had been told to say goodbye. His head was swollen, his face barely recognizable. Blood seeped from his ears and nose. The machines kept him alive, but no one knew for how long. I don't know how to describe what it's like to be in a room like that. The kind of grief that fills the air is suffocating. It's not loud. There's no screaming, no dramatic outbursts. It's just silent, heavy, like the weight of it is pressing down on you, making it hard to breathe. The driver's parents eventually made the decision. They turned off his life support. He passed away soon after. 2 first cousins gone. The guy in the back seat was still alive, but no one thought he would be for long. And then somehow he lived. Against every expectation, he survived. His brain bleed stabilized, the swelling went down, and he started waking up. He was confused, disoriented, but he was there. The doctors couldn't explain it. They had been sure he would either die or be completely brain damaged. Instead, he kept improving. His leg was shattered, badly broken, but that was nothing compared to what could have happened. The only reason he survived, they said, was because of the way his leg had been caught in the seat when he was thrown forward. It stopped him from going through the windshield like the others. At first, everyone was relieved. The families of the two cousins were even sympathetic toward him. But as he kept getting better, something changed. Grief does strange things to people. It twists them, makes them look for someone to blame. And since they couldn't blame their own sons, one of whom had been driving drunk, the other who had willingly gotten into the car without a seatbelt, they turned on the only survivor. The sympathy faded. Whispers started. It was his fault, they said. He had called them, asked for a ride. If they hadn't gone back for him, they would still be alive. It didn't matter that they had been drinking before he even called. It didn't matter that the driver had been the one speeding, the one who lost control. None of that mattered. All that mattered was that two boys were dead, and he was alive. He felt it too. I don't know if he blamed himself, but I know he carried the weight of it. Every look, every cold shoulder, every whisper, it all landed on him. He wasn't just recovering from his injuries. He was trying to survive in a town that now saw him as the reason for their loss. The funerals were unbearable. Two young men, buried days apart. The town came out in full force, the way small communities do. Flowers, condolences, support for the families of the dead. For the survivor, there was nothing. He still walks around like a ghost. Physically, he's fine, but you can see it in his eyes. He knows. He knows what people think. He knows that no matter how much time passes, there are people who will never look at him the same way again. And the truth is, if they had been wearing seat belts, they probably all would have walked away with minor injuries. That's what gets me the most. Not just the drinking, not just the speeding, but how easily it could have been avoided. If they had taken 5 seconds to buckle up, none of this would have happened. But they didn't. And now, two of them are dead. And the one who lived has to carry that for the rest of his life. I was sitting with my grandfather by the pool, listening to his war stories. It was late. The air was thick with the smell of chlorine and damp concrete, the sound of crickets filling the space between us. His cup of white wine sat on the plastic patio table beside him, sweating in the humid night air. It was always white wine. I don't think I ever saw him drink anything else. I was too young to notice back then, but looking back, he was always drinking. Morning, noon, and night, there was always a cup in his hand. I never once saw him drink water unless we were at a restaurant, and even then, he never touched it. I didn't know how to recognize the signs at the time, didn't understand how much of his personality had been warped by alcohol, how much of the man he had once been had drowned in it. To me, he was just my grandfather. He was grouchy, mean sometimes, and had a thick Louisiana drawl that slurred together even when he was sober. We sat there under the dim porch light, the pool water shifting lazily beside us. The night felt still, hot and sticky. A mosquito whined in my ear, and I slapped at it absent-mindedly while he talked. War stories. He always had war stories. I liked them when I was younger. They made him seem bigger, more important. He'd been a Navy captain, at least that's what he told me. I never really understood the ranks, never cared enough to ask. All I knew was that he had seen things, been places I could never imagine, and his stories made the world feel wider. That night, though, something was different. He was leaning back in his chair, cup in hand, his voice thick with something I hadn't recognized before. At first, I thought it was just the heat making him sluggish, but then I noticed the way his words were dragging, the way his lips curled into a slow, mean smile. He started laughing, shaking his head, and then he told me something that made my stomach turn. He talked about being on a boat, stationed somewhere near a foreign island. He never said which one. He said that he and his men used to fire at huts along the shore. Not for strategic reasons, not for war, just for fun. They'd wait until they saw someone go inside, or sometimes they wouldn't wait at all. They'd just shoot, watching the thatched roofs and wooden walls explode into splinters. He laughed when he told me this. Actually laughed. It was a slurred, wheezing thing, like the wine was still stuck in his throat. His shoulders shook, and he wiped at his face as if the memory itself was something funny, like an old joke he had just remembered. I sat there, frozen, watching him. I wanted to believe I had misheard him. His accent was thick, his words running together, and the wine had loosened his tongue so much that half of what he was saying came out as a mumble. I told myself that maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe I had missed some context, some crucial piece of the story that would make it less horrifying. So I asked him to repeat himself, and he did. The second time, I understood every word. I felt sick. The weight of what he had just admitted sank into me like a stone. It wasn't just some offhand remark. It wasn't something said in the heat of battle. This was deliberate, casual. He had done it, and he had enjoyed it. I stood up. He didn't stop talking right away. I don't think he even realized I was leaving at first. He just kept laughing, shaking his head, his fingers wrapped around the sweating plastic cup. Then, as I turned to walk away, he fell silent. I think in that moment, he understood that he had said something he shouldn't have, that he had shown me something I wasn't supposed to see. I muttered a quick goodnight over my shoulder and walked inside. I barely slept that night. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying his words over and over again. I had always known he was harsh, angry, maybe even cruel in small ways. But this was something different. This was worse. This was a kind of cruelty I hadn't known existed in him. And it didn't end there. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The blinders had been ripped off, and suddenly, I started noticing all the little things I had ignored before. The casual racist remarks. The way he talked about people who weren't like him. The way he justified things that had no justification. And it wasn't just him. His daughters, my mother, my aunt, they would brush it off, laugh it away, sometimes even agree with him. Not in the same blatant, cruel way, but in quieter ways, in nods and knowing glances, in words spoken just low enough to make sure the wrong people didn't hear. It was disgusting. I hated it. I started avoiding him after that. I stopped sitting by the pool at night, stopped listening to his stories. When family gatherings came around, I kept my distance. If he spoke, I let his words roll over me without reacting, without engaging. And he noticed. I think some part of him knew what he had done, knew that I had seen through him. And I think that bothered him. He never outright acknowledged it, never apologized, never tried to explain. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I caught him looking at me with something like resentment in his eyes. Maybe he blamed me for seeing the truth. Maybe he blamed himself for slipping. Either way, it didn't matter. Years passed. He got older, sicker. The drinking never stopped. The wine glass remained in his hand until the end. And then one day he was gone. There was no great reckoning, no final conversation, no closure, just silence. And I was fine with that. Because in the end, some things don't deserve to be forgiven. And he was one of them. I woke up to the sound of a scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was sharp, raw, and full of something that made my stomach twist before I was even fully awake. It wasn't a scream from inside the house. It was distant, but not far enough. Somewhere close outside. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I threw off my blanket, heart pounding, and scrambled out of bed. The room felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every small noise feel louder than it should be. My own breath sounded strange, like it didn't belong to me. My hands felt shaky as I pulled on a pair of shorts and rushed out of my room. As I moved through the hallway, I caught a glimpse of the front window. My sister was across the street, pounding on our neighbor's door. Her whole body shook as she screamed and cried, her face twisted with something I had never seen before, something that didn't belong to her. I didn't understand. I turned away from the window and hurried into the kitchen. That's when I saw her, my mom, hanging. Everything inside me stopped. The air in my lungs froze. My brain refused to understand what I was looking at. The bar stool, the one I always sat on, was tipped over on the floor. The leash, our dog's leash, wrapped around her back, pulling her up, her body completely still. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My mouth opened, but my voice felt lost, buried under the weight of everything that was wrong with this moment. The walls of our home suddenly felt too small, too close, pressing in on me like they were about to crush me. Mom! The word shot out of me, cracking, breaking apart before it could even reach her. It didn't make sense. This didn't make sense. I took a step forward, then another, my legs weak beneath me. Mom! She didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. A part of me thought that if I just stood still, if I just looked long enough, this moment would break apart like a dream. That she would move. That she would breathe. That somehow, some way, this wasn't what it looked like. But nothing changed. The air felt heavy, thick, pressing down on me as my stomach twisted itself into something tight and painful. My ears were ringing, drowning out everything else. I don't even remember running to the front door. I just remember being outside, the sun blinding me for a second before my eyes adjusted. I wasn't crying. I was screaming. It was like the sound had been trapped in my chest, fighting to get out. It didn't even feel like my voice anymore. It was something raw, something I didn't even know I could make. My feet hit the pavement, but I didn't know where I was running. My sister was still across the street, still pounding on the neighbor's door, her body shaking with sobs. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was in college. She wasn't supposed to be here today. I don't even remember stopping. I don't know if I collapsed or if someone grabbed me. Everything after that blurred together, pieces that didn't fit, sounds that didn't make sense. People's voices felt distant, like they were coming from underwater. I don't remember crying. Not at first. I remember the police arriving. The neighbors standing outside, whispering, their faces pale and hollow. My sister shaking so hard she could barely stand. I don't know how much time passed before someone took me inside. Maybe an officer. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone else. I don't remember their face. The house felt wrong, like it wasn't ours anymore. Like the walls had been replaced with something cold and unfamiliar. They wouldn't let me see her again. Not after that first time. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Hanging there. The leash wrapped around her. The stool on the floor. The way the sunlight had streamed through the window, making everything look too normal, too peaceful, when nothing about it was. It didn't feel real. Days passed, but they didn't feel like days. Everything blurred together. People came and went, their voices quiet, careful. My sister barely spoke. I barely spoke. There was nothing to say. I don't know when I finally cried. Maybe it was when I was alone. Maybe it was in the middle of the night, when the weight of it all finally crushed me. But once I started, I couldn't stop. It was like every moment I had held it back came pouring out all at once. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shove it back down. I later found out my sister had come home as a surprise. She had wanted to visit for the weekend, to surprise Mom. Instead, she found her first. I don't think she ever forgave herself for that. I don't know if I ever forgave myself either. I replayed that morning over and over in my head. Every sound, every second. What if I had woken up earlier? What if I had gone downstairs before she did it? What if I had noticed something, anything, that told me she wasn't okay? But I hadn't, and I would never get to ask her why. Life didn't stop after that, even though it felt like it should have. People kept moving, talking, living, like the world hadn't just shattered around us. Like nothing had changed. But for us, everything had. For weeks, I expected to see her walk into the room, to hear her voice, to wake up and realize it had all been a mistake. But she was gone. And no matter how much I wished, no matter how much I screamed into my pillow at night, no matter how many times I closed my eyes and tried to picture something different, the truth never changed. She was gone, and I had been the one to find her. I remember the exact moment it happened. Not just the sight of it, but everything. The sounds, the smells, the way time seemed to both stop and speed up at once. It was 1998. I was 17. My girlfriend and I had gone into Dublin for the day. Nothing special, just killing time, wandering in and out of shops. We ended up in Stephen's Green shopping center, one of the places we always seemed to end up. Stephen's Green was always busy, especially on a Saturday. The layout of the place was open and airy. The way the floors overlooked each other made it feel massive, like you could see everything at once. There were railings along the edges of the upper floors, giving you a clear view of the lower level. The floor beneath was smooth and polished, that off-white tile that always looked clean even when thousands of people walked over it every day. We had split up for a bit. My girlfriend wanted to try on some clothes, and I wasn't in the mood to stand around waiting. I told her I'd be nearby, just looking at some cards. There was a card stand set up in the open space of the lower level, one of those little kiosks selling greeting cards, birthday cards, all that kind of stuff. Nothing I actually cared about, just something to flip through while I waited. The crowd around me was the usual mix: couples, families, groups of teenagers. People chatting, laughing, carrying shopping bags. A normal day, just like any other. I don't even remember what card I was looking at when it happened. I was standing there, flipping through them, when something in my peripheral vision changed. A blur, a shadow above me, something moving fast. Then impact. A sickening, solid thud. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain rejected it. It was like my mind refused to process what was right in front of me. A man had just hit the floor. He was 3 feet from me. 3 feet. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on him, my body frozen in place. The world around me seemed to muffle, like I'd been dunked underwater. I could hear the sound of air rushing back into the space after the impact, the echoes of footsteps suddenly stopping, the gasps and murmurs of people who had just realized what had happened. The man was on his back, sprawled out. He had jumped from the 2nd floor. His body looked broken. His limbs were at unnatural angles, his head tilted slightly to one side. But what I remember the most, what's burned into my memory, is the blood. At first, it was just a small pool beneath his head. But then it started to spread. Thick, dark red seeping outward in all directions, forming a slow-moving halo around him. It was so vivid, so real, but at the same time, my brain kept insisting that it wasn't. Like something out of a movie. That's the only way I can describe it. A scene playing out in front of me that I wasn't actually part of, like I was just watching it on a screen. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, minutes. It felt like time had bent around me, stretching and compressing all at once. Then the spell broke. Someone screamed. A real, raw, human scream. And then everything rushed back. Noise. People shouting, people running. A woman covering her mouth in shock. A security guard pushing through the crowd, already reaching for his radio. More people coming to see what happened, their faces shifting from curiosity to horror as they saw the man on the ground. I took a step back. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like I was floating outside of myself. I don't even remember breathing. I just felt cold, despite the warmth of the shopping center, despite the body heat of the crowd pressing in around me. The smell of copper filled the air. The blood was still spreading. I looked up, instinctively, toward the 2nd floor. People were standing by the railing, looking down, some with hands over their mouths, some with wide, stunned eyes. I tried to figure out where he had come from. Had he climbed over the railing? Had anyone seen him before he jumped? Did anyone try to stop him? I heard more voices. Someone shouting for help. Someone else crying. A mother pulling her child away, turning them so they wouldn't see. A man was trying to talk to the security guard, gesturing toward the body, his voice frantic. And then sirens. Distant at first, but getting closer. I still hadn't moved much. I was just standing there, taking it all in. It wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic music, no slow-motion reaction shots. Just raw, unfiltered reality. The paramedics arrived. The crowd parted for them, but not entirely. People still wanted to see. Human nature, I guess. We can't help but look. I saw one of them kneel beside the man, checking for something, anything. A pulse, movement, some sign of life. The other was already talking into a radio, their tone clipped, professional. They'd seen this before. I don't know how long it took for them to decide. Maybe a few minutes, maybe less. But eventually, I saw one of them shake their head. Just a small movement, barely noticeable. But it said everything. The man wasn't getting up. I finally backed away. My legs felt shaky, unsteady. My heart was hammering in my chest, though I hadn't even noticed it until then. I needed to find my girlfriend. I turned and walked. Stumbled away from the scene, my hands trembling, my mouth dry. The further I got, the more distant the noise became. But the image stayed with me. That moment, frozen in time. The body, the blood. I found her back near the clothing store. She hadn't seen it happen. She had no idea what had just unfolded a few feet away. But the moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. I didn't say much. I don't even remember what I told her. Something vague. Something that made sense, but didn't really capture the weight of it. And then we left. We walked out of the shopping center into the bright Dublin afternoon. People were still going about their day, unaware that inside, just beyond those glass doors, someone's life had ended. I didn't look back. For days, I kept replaying it in my head. The way the man fell. The way the blood spread. The way everything just stopped for a moment, as if the world itself had held its breath. I don't know who he was. I never found out. No name, no story. Just a man who jumped. And even now, all these years later, I still think about him. I still remember. I don't know why I agreed to meet him in the first place. I guess I had been feeling lonely, stuck in the same cycle of work, home, scrolling on my phone, watching the same TV shows on repeat. My friends had all either moved away, settled into serious relationships, or just drifted out of my life. I told myself that it was just dinner, just a harmless date with someone who seemed normal enough. His name was Ryan. At least, that's what his profile said. We had been chatting for a few weeks. Nothing deep, just the usual, work, hobbies, what we like to do on the weekends. He was good-looking in a way that didn't seem intimidating, with soft brown eyes and an easy smile in his pictures. He worked in finance, apparently, and lived in London, not too far from me. When he asked if I wanted to meet for dinner, I hesitated. But I could hear my best friend's voice in my head telling me to put myself out there. So I said yes. We met at a small restaurant in the city, a cozy place with dim lighting and dark wooden tables. When I arrived, he was already waiting at a table near the back, sipping a glass of wine. He looked just like his pictures, but something about him in person felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. He was polite, smiled at all the right moments, asked me questions about my life, but I couldn't shake this strange feeling in my stomach. At first, I thought it was just nerves, but as the meal went on, I started to feel worse. My head felt heavy, my thoughts slower than usual, like I was wading through thick water. I barely touched my food. "Are you all right?" he asked at one point, tilting his head slightly. I nodded quickly. I didn't want to make a scene, but something wasn't right. My limbs felt sluggish, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I needed to go home. I forced a smile, told him I wasn't feeling well, and asked if he could take me back. He didn't argue. If anything, he seemed almost pleased. The ride home felt strange. The world outside the window blurred together in streaks of light, and I had to keep my eyes open to stay focused. He was talking about something, but I could barely process his words. When we reached my flat, I hesitated at the door. I didn't even know why I said it, but the words came out automatically. "Do you want to come in for a coffee?" Even as I said it, something deep inside me screamed no. But he said yes. He followed me inside, and I tried to keep my movements steady as I fumbled with the kettle. He sat at the small table in my kitchen, watching me. I couldn't focus on anything. My head was buzzing, my limbs weak. I barely remember him leaving. I just remember the feeling of my bed, the relief of lying down, and then blackness. When I woke up, the room was dark. For a few seconds, I couldn't remember anything. My head was pounding, my throat dry. Then a sound broke through the silence, something soft, the faintest rustling, like fabric moving against fabric. I froze. Someone was in my flat. I stayed completely still, listening. My phone was on the nightstand, but it felt so far away. I forced myself to move, inching my fingers toward it as quietly as possible. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then I heard it breathing. Slow, deep, coming from somewhere in the flat. I grabbed my phone and unlocked it with shaky hands. The screen's glow felt blinding in the darkness. I dialed 999 and pressed the phone to my ear, trying to breathe quietly. The operator's voice came through instantly. I whispered that someone was in my home. They told me to stay quiet, to stay on the line. Officers were on the way. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate. Not the sound of someone searching for valuables, but something else. I knew he was still here. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't make a sound. The seconds stretched into eternity as I listened. The police were close. I just had to hold on. Then, a creak, the hallway floorboard. He was coming closer. The operator told me the officers were outside. I gripped the phone like a lifeline, barely breathing. Then, a crash, The front door burst open, the sound of heavy boots, loud voices. I stayed frozen in my bed, heart pounding as I heard them shouting, moving through the flat. I didn't move until I heard one of them call out that it was safe. I stumbled out of my room, legs weak, and saw them. The officers. And then I saw him. He was in the living room, standing near the sofa. Plastic sheets covered the walls and floor. On the table, neatly arranged, were knives, ropes, duct tape. Tools I didn't want to look at too closely. He didn't fight when they took him away. He barely even reacted. One of the officers told me later, after I had calmed down, that I was lucky, that I had woken up in time, that the only reason I woke up at all was because the roofie hadn't fully worked. I barely heard him. I just kept staring at the plastic-covered walls, thinking about how I had invited him in, thinking about how close I had come to never waking up at all. I don't go on dates anymore. I don't use Tinder. I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, convinced I can hear breathing in the dark. I know it's just in my head. At least, I hope it is. I was already in bed when the knocking started. Heavy, desperate pounding against the front door, the sound cutting through the quiet of the house like a hammer on steel. It jolted me awake instantly, and I could feel my heartbeat thudding against my ribs before I even fully understood what was happening. Then came the screaming. "Help me! Please! He's after me! Please, somebody help me!" The voice was high, frantic, trembling on the edge of pure panic. The words carried through the night with an urgency that felt designed to light up every instinct inside me. My stomach clenched, my breath caught in my throat. The dogs were already going wild, barking and clawing at the front door. Their deep, guttural growls echoed up the stairs, filling the whole house with noise and chaos. I was halfway out of bed before I even thought about it. Years of living in a quiet neighborhood made my reaction automatic. I wasn't used to trouble, and my first instinct was to go see what was wrong. But then my wife grabbed my wrist. I stopped. The way her fingers tightened around me, the sharpness in her grip, made something in my brain switch from panic to awareness. "It's a trap," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the dogs, but the certainty in it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I turned to her, still breathing hard. She was sitting up, eyes locked on the bedroom door, listening. Her face was tense, her shoulders rigid. I wanted to ask why she thought that. What about the situation made her so sure? But I didn't have to. The longer I stood there, the more I realized something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The knocking was too steady, too forceful. Not the panicked, erratic slams of someone being chased. The voice was desperate, yes, but it didn't waver, didn't break down into sobs or lose control. It was rehearsed. And then there was the simple fact that the entranceway light was on. I had left it on before going to bed, like I always did. The woman at the door could see inside, could see the glow spilling into the hallway, could see that nobody was coming down the stairs. Yet she kept knocking, kept screaming. I realized, with a sickening feeling, that she wasn't really asking for help. She was waiting for someone to open the door. I swallowed hard and backed away from the bedroom door, careful not to make any noise. The dogs were still barking, their claws scraping against the wood as they threw themselves at the entrance. If this was real, if this woman was truly in danger, why hadn't she run to a neighbor's house? Why hadn't she screamed for help from the street? Why was she only focused on our door? My wife was already moving toward the window, keeping the lights off, staying in the shadows. I followed her lead, stepping carefully as I moved to the window in our bedroom. From here, I could see part of the porch, the top of the front steps, and the woman standing just outside the door. She was wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, her hood up. She had her back pressed against the doorframe, head turning sharply every few seconds as if expecting someone to burst out of the woods at any moment. But something about the way she moved didn't feel right. It was controlled, not the jittery, uncontrollable movements of someone in blind fear. Then I noticed something else. She wasn't looking at the street. She wasn't even looking toward the trees. She was glancing toward the side of the house, like she was waiting for something. A slow, crawling dread wrapped around my spine. I stepped back from the window and turned to my wife. "I need to check the other side," I whispered. She nodded. I moved quickly but carefully, making sure to stay in the dark, stepping around the spots in the floor that creaked. Our house had several windows on the second floor, all with a decent view of the property. The bedroom next to ours overlooked the front yard, and I checked there first. Nothing new. I moved down the hall. The guest room gave me a better angle of the street, but the woman was the only person I could see. Then I got to our son's old room. It was a corner room, which meant the side window gave me a view of the yard leading toward the woods. I parted the curtain just slightly, peering through the narrow gap, and my stomach dropped. There was a man crouching in the bushes. He was low, almost completely hidden in the dark, but the faint glow from the streetlight caught just enough of his silhouette. I could see the way his shoulders hunched forward, the way he held himself perfectly still. Waiting, I felt a chill run through my whole body. I stayed frozen for a moment, watching, trying to see more details in the dark. But I didn't need to. I had seen enough. I moved away from the window, heart hammering against my ribs, and rushed back to my wife. "Call the police," I said quietly. She didn't hesitate. The call was made in a whisper. We didn't want the woman at the door to hear. We didn't want the man in the bushes to know. Minutes passed. The knocking slowed. The woman's voice became less desperate. And then, just as we saw the first flicker of blue lights in the distance, the man in the bushes moved. He bolted from his hiding spot, running out toward the street, but he didn't sprint like a man caught in the act. He jogged, casual, steady, like he had just been out for an evening run, like he hadn't been crouched in our yard, waiting for us to open the door. By the time the police pulled up, he was already halfway down the block. They didn't chase him. They questioned him. He said he was just jogging. The woman, when questioned, said she had been looking for help, but didn't explain why she hadn't run to another house. They weren't arrested. There was no law against knocking on a door and asking for help. No law against jogging at night. The police left. The woman and the man disappeared into the dark. And that was it. At least, it was until later that week. A few days after it happened, we heard the news from a friend who lived a few neighborhoods over. A couple had been tied up and robbed in their own home. The woman at the door had been frantic, begging for help. They let her in. The man came in after her. I didn't sleep much that night. Even though it was over, even though they hadn't gotten into our house, I kept thinking about what would have happened if my wife hadn't stopped me. If I had run downstairs, if I had thrown open the door without thinking. I kept thinking about the way the woman had knocked, steady and deliberate. I kept thinking about the man in the bushes, waiting. I kept thinking about the way he had jogged away, as if nothing had happened. I kept thinking about how close we had come to making a terrible mistake. And I kept the upstairs lights off whenever I looked out the window at night, because sometimes the dark was the only thing keeping us safe. I was 10 years old the summer I stayed at my friend's farm. It was the kind of place that felt like an entire world of its own, stretching far beyond what my young mind could grasp. The farm sat on rolling land covered in sugarcane fields, endless rows of tall, rustling stalks that swayed with the wind. There was a chicken coop near the house, always full of movement, full of noise. The air smelled of earth and grain and warm feathers. My friend's family had lived there for generations. It was their home, their livelihood, a place that had always seemed safe. At that age, the world still felt simple. I didn't think much about history, about who had owned what land before, about the past bleeding into the present. To me, the farm was just a place where I could run, explore, and spend my days fishing in the creek that cut through the back of the property. That day, my friend and I had spent the morning near the house, kicking up dust as we chased each other between the chicken coops, throwing sticks, making up stories about hidden treasure buried beneath the sugarcane. By midday, the sun was high, and the heat pressed down heavy on us. That was when we decided to go fishing. The creek was a short walk from the house, hidden past a small line of trees. It wasn't much, a slow-moving stream of water, murky in places, but it was ours. We had fished there before, catching little more than tiny, wriggling fish that weren't big enough to eat. Still, it was something to do. We had been sitting on the bank for maybe an hour, watching the water, when my father arrived. I hadn't expected to see him there. He walked toward us with a strange urgency, his face unreadable, his movements tense. I didn't question it when he told us we had to go home. He didn't explain why, and I didn't think to ask. I remember glancing at my friend, but he didn't seem concerned, so neither was I. We left the fishing rods where they were, abandoned at the water's edge, and followed my father back to the house. I only found out the truth the next morning. Some men had come to the farm while we were at the creek. They weren't thieves, at least not in the way I understood thieves to be. They hadn't come for money, for supplies, for anything they could take. They had come for revenge, or at least what they believed was justice. The land, they thought, had once belonged to their ancestors. It had been stolen a long time ago. And now, they had come to take it back in the only way they thought they could. My friend's parents weren't home when it happened. They had gone into town, leaving the farm in the hands of the staff, and the elderly grandparents who lived in the second house on the property. The maid had been the first to see them. I don't know how many there were, maybe 3, maybe 4, but they weren't hiding their intentions. They had come for the owners, but when they found the house empty, they turned their attention to her. I don't know how long it lasted, how much time stretched between the moment they entered and the moment the alarm was triggered. Maybe she had tried to reason with them, to tell them the owners weren't there, that she didn't know where they were. Maybe she had hoped they would leave. But when she refused to give them information, they made an example of her. I didn't know her well. She had been kind, in the way that most people who worked in houses were to children. She had probably brought us food, scolded us lightly when we ran too close to the kitchen, reminded us to take our muddy shoes off before stepping inside. She had probably seen us that morning, running past her without a second thought, laughing carefree. They had cut off her hand. She must have pressed the panic button before it happened, or maybe she had done it in the moment, in a last act of defiance. I don't know, but the alarm had gone off, and that alarm didn't just ring inside the house. It rang in the second house, where my friend's grandparents lived. His grandfather had been a farmer all his life, but more than that, he had been a soldier once. When the alarm sounded, he knew what it meant, and he didn't hesitate. The men had already begun to leave when he spotted them. Maybe they had been satisfied with what they had done. Maybe they had realized they wouldn't find what they were looking for. Maybe the sound of the alarm had rattled them. It didn't matter. He had seen them, and that was all that counted. He chased them. I don't know how many shots he fired. I don't know if any of them hit their mark. I only know that by the time he was done, they were gone. I never saw the maid again. She never came back to work, and I don't know what became of her after that. I only know that she left without a hand, and that no one could change that. The farm didn't change much after that day. My friend's family still lives there. The fields still stretch wide, the sugarcane still sways in the wind, and the chickens still scratch in the dust. Time moved forward, the way it always does, smoothing over the past like a stone in a river, but I never forgot what happened. I think about it sometimes, about how close we had been, about how, if things had been different, if we had been in the house instead of at the creek, maybe they would have found us. Maybe we wouldn't have walked away untouched. I think about my father, about the way he had come for us without telling us why, about the quiet urgency in his steps, about the way he must have known, must have heard, must have come as fast as he could. I think about the maid, about what it must have felt like to be in that house, knowing there was no one coming to save her. The farm is still there. My friend's family is still there. Life went on, but some things don't fade, no matter how much time passes. And I don't think they ever will. It was a warm summer morning, sometime in the late 90s, before cell phones were everywhere, before every kid had one glued to their hands. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and warm pavement as I got ready for work, moving through my usual morning routine. My daughter, 14 years old and enjoying her summer vacation, was still in bed. It was nearly impossible to wake her up before noon when she didn't have school. I didn't bother trying. Just as I grabbed my keys, the phone rang. I almost ignored it. I was running a little late, but something made me pick it up. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the way the sound cut through the quiet house. Hello. The voice on the other end was polite. Male. Young, but not quite a boy. He asked to speak to my daughter. Something felt off immediately. My daughter had plenty of friends, but most of the boys who called had voices that cracked between childhood and adulthood. This one didn't. It was smooth, confident. Older. I asked him how old he was. He answered, still polite, still calm. 21. 21. Something in me, some deep, instinctual thing, stiffened at that. There was no reason a 21-year-old man should be calling my 14-year-old daughter. My voice sharpened. I told him she wasn't in the habit of receiving calls from grown men, and if he ever called again, I would call the police. I made sure he understood. He said he did. I hung up hard, slamming the receiver down with more force than necessary. My heart was beating a little faster than before. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, waiting to see if it would ring again. It didn't. I left for work, shaking off the unease. By the time I got there, I had mostly pushed it out of my mind. I mentioned it in passing to a coworker, expecting maybe a frown or a nod of concern. Instead, she laughed. Probably just some dumb kid trying his luck, she said. Maybe she was right. The rest of the day went on as usual. I came home, my daughter was fine, and summer stretched on. A few weeks later, I woke up early again, just like always. The sky was soft and pale, the heat not yet settled in. I stepped outside to grab the newspaper from the front porch, already thinking about the day ahead. Then I saw the headline. They had found the remains of a young girl in a wooded area. I froze, paper halfway unfolded in my hands. The name, *** Tina Franks ***, jumped out at me. It took me a second to place it. My daughter had two friends named Tina from our old neighborhood. I felt cold. I went inside, moving on autopilot, and walked to my daughter's room. She was still asleep, curled up under the covers. I didn't wake her. Instead, I left the newspaper on her nightstand. Hours later, I was at work when the phone rang. My daughter's voice on the other end was small, shaking. "It's her," she said. "It's my friend." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and left work immediately, not caring what my boss thought. I drove home, my mind racing the whole way. When I walked through the door, she was sitting on the couch, still in her pajamas, clutching the newspaper like it might disappear if she let go. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She told me what she knew. She hadn't seen Tina in months. The last time was at a bus stop downtown, toward the end of the school year. Tina had tried to convince her to come to a party, but she already had plans. She was meeting me for dinner and a movie. She had no idea what happened to her after that. The news filled in the rest. The police had found a young man bound and bleeding near the Trans-Canada Highway. He had been in the woods with a man and two teenage girls drinking. He remembered getting hit over the head with a bat. When he woke up, he was tied up. Somehow, he managed to free himself. He stumbled through the forest, injured and disoriented, until he reached the highway. That led the police back to the woods. 7 hours later, they found the man. He was in a van. Inside, there were two girls, alive but beaten, raped. The police found videotapes of the assaults. Not far from the van, they found Tina's remains. The details made my stomach turn. I couldn't stop picturing her, alone in the woods with him. And then came the worst part. A few days after the news broke, my daughter got a call from the police. They wanted to ask her questions about the last time she saw Tina. She told them about the bus stop. Then they asked something else. Did she know why her phone number was underlined in Tina's address book? My chest tightened. I knew, even before they said it. The man, the killer, had Tina's address book. He had my daughter's name, our number. I sat there, my head spinning, and thought about that phone call. The one I got that morning, weeks ago. The polite young man. The 21-year-old asking for my daughter. I had spoken to him. My skin crawled at the realization. I had heard the voice of a killer, and I hadn't known. I had been polite at first. He had been polite too. I had almost let my guard down. Almost. I thought about what could have happened if I hadn't pressed him. If I hadn't made it clear he wasn't welcome. If I hadn't scared him off. My daughter could have been in that van. I sat there, staring at her, my heart pounding. I had saved her life by being a rude, overbearing mom. Years passed. My daughter grew up, went to college, got married. She had two beautiful girls of her own. She was happy safe. But she never forgot. Neither did I. She was careful with her own daughters. Protective. Maybe even overbearing, some might say. Her girls called her Mama Bear. Every time I heard it, I thought about that morning. About the phone call. About the voice on the other end of the line. And about how sometimes being overbearing is the only thing that stands between life and death. I lived alone in a small first-floor apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The building was old, the walls thin, and the floors creaky, but the rent was cheap, and I had never felt unsafe there. The neighborhood wasn't the best, some rundown houses, a few people who wandered the streets at odd hours, but it wasn't a place that made me constantly look over my shoulder. I locked my doors at night, kept my curtains closed, and minded my own business. That had always been enough. That night, I was winding down the way I always did. Lights low, book in hand, curled up in bed with my blanket pulled up to my chest. My bedroom wasn't really a separate room, more like a studio-style space down a short hallway from the living room and kitchen. I liked to keep my bedroom door closed and locked at night, not because I was paranoid, but because it made me feel a little more secure, like I had an extra layer of protection between me and the rest of the world. The night was quiet. No cars blasting music outside. No neighbors shouting, Nothing but the hum of my heater clicking on and off. I turned a page in my book, completely lost in the story, when, bang, a loud crash from the kitchen. I froze. A split second later, the sound of glass breaking. My whole body went rigid. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could hear it. I stared at my bedroom door, my fingers gripping the book so tightly that the pages crumpled beneath my hands. I hadn't imagined that. That was real. Something, someone was in my apartment. I stayed completely still, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps? Breathing? The rustle of fabric? But there was nothing. Just silence. I swallowed hard. My mind raced through the possibilities. The window in the kitchen? No, I always kept it locked. The front door? Also locked. But locks didn't always stop people. If someone had broken in, they could be standing in my living room right now, listening, waiting. I needed to move. Slowly, as quietly as possible, I slid out of bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold floor. Every tiny sound I made felt deafening. I tiptoed toward the closet, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I reached for the doorknob, hands trembling, and eased it open just enough to slip inside. It was small, filled with clothes and stacked boxes. I crouched down in the corner, wedging myself behind a pile of shoes, trying to make myself as small as possible. I wrapped my arms around my knees, pulling them to my chest. And then I just sat there. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body tense and aching. Seconds dragged by, stretching into minutes. My ears picked up every tiny noise, the hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the pipes in the walls, the distant sound of a car passing by outside. But nothing else. No footsteps. No movement. I wanted to check my phone, but it was still sitting on my nightstand, way too far for me to reach without making noise. Calling the police crossed my mind, but that would mean talking, giving away my location. And even if I did call them, I'd have to open my front door for them when they arrived. What if whoever was out there was just waiting for me to make a move? So I stayed put. The closet was stuffy, the air thick and warm. My legs started cramping, but I didn't dare shift. My mind kept cycling through worst-case scenarios. What if they were still standing in the living room, listening for any sound? What if they knew I was in here? I tried to control my breathing, keeping it slow, quiet, even though my chest felt like it was on fire from holding back panic. At some point, I lost track of time. It felt like hours, but it was probably less than one. Eventually, my brain convinced me that if someone had broken in, they would have done something by now. The silence stretched on unbroken, and I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it, or maybe they were gone. I swallowed, my throat dry. I needed to check. Moving painfully slow, I shifted my weight and reached for the closet door. My fingers barely brushed the handle before I hesitated. What if they were still out there? What if they were waiting, just outside my bedroom door? I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't stay in here forever. Summoning what little courage I had left, I turned the knob and pushed the door open an inch. Nothing. No sounds, no movement. I crept out, stepping carefully to avoid the creaky spots in the floor, then made my way back to my bed. I didn't check the living room. I didn't check the kitchen. I didn't even unlock my bedroom door. I just crawled back into bed, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling, wide-eyed, heart still racing. I barely slept. When morning finally came, the apartment was bathed in soft gray light. The fear that had paralyzed me the night before had dulled, but it still sat heavy in my chest. I needed to see what had happened. I unlocked my bedroom door, every nerve in my body still on edge. The living room looked the same as I had left it. No overturned furniture, no sign of forced entry. The front door was still locked. The window was still locked. Then I stepped into the kitchen, and there on the floor was a shattered glass bowl. My stomach flipped. My eyes traveled up to the fridge, where a small, round cookie tin used to sit. It must have shifted, maybe from the vibrations of the heater turning on, and rolled off the top, knocking the bowl off the counter on its way down. That was it. That was the intruder. A goddamn cookie tin. I stood there, staring at the broken glass, feeling a mix of emotions so strong I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. I had spent an hour hiding in my closet, convinced I was about to be murdered because my dishes made a scary noise in the middle of the night. The fear that had felt so real, so overwhelming, suddenly seemed ridiculous. I shook my head, letting out a shaky breath. My body was still tense, my hands still unsteady. Even knowing the truth, my nerves were fried. I felt exhausted, wrung out. I cleaned up the broken glass, sweeping every last shard into the trash. Then I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty spot on the fridge where the tin used to be, still feeling the echoes of fear in my chest. It was just a stupid accident, but for that 1 hour, trapped in my own mind, it had felt like the end of the world. I don't know how long I sat in the car before finally working up the nerve to go inside. It wasn't like I had any reason to be scared. Not yet. The parking lot was quiet except for the low hum of streetlights, and a warm breeze carried the smell of asphalt and cut grass. It was one of those nights that felt stuck between seasons, the air not quite summer, not quite fall. The kind of night that didn't care what had happened inside that apartment. I locked my car and headed up the stairs, 2 flights to the unit I shared with my best friend and his wife. She had called me maybe 10 minutes ago, asking me to check on him. Said she had been trying to reach him all day. It wasn't like him to ignore his phone. I told her not to worry, that maybe he had just fallen asleep early or was watching TV with his ringer off. But the longer I stood in front of the door, fishing my keys out of my pocket, the heavier the feeling in my chest got. I let myself in. The apartment was dark except for the glow of the kitchen light spilling down the hallway. The air felt still, unmoved, like the place had been untouched for hours. I took a few steps inside, my sneakers pressing into the carpet, and called his name. No answer. The living room was just ahead, open to the kitchen. And that's where I saw him. He was in front of the couch, his knees on the floor, his upper body draped over the seat cushion like he had passed out mid-prayer. His arms were folded beneath his head, his fingers curled into the sleeves of his sweatshirt. I let out a breath. Jesus, he really had just fallen asleep. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I called his name again, my voice low, careful not to startle him. Nothing. I stepped closer. There was no movement, no shift in his shoulders, no sleepy mumble of acknowledgement, no sound of breath. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, and I knew. His body was cold, unnaturally cold. Not just cool from the AC running too long or from being uncovered in a nap. Asterisk, asterisk, cold. Asterisk, asterisk. I pulled back, my stomach lurching, my mind refusing to process what my body already understood. I told myself I was imagining things, that the cold was just a trick of my own nerves, my own anxiety playing games with my senses. I grabbed his arm, meaning to shake him awake. It didn't move right. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over the coffee table. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. The room swayed, the floor tilting, the air thick and suffocating. No. This wasn't happening. I swallowed, forcing myself to move, to act. My hands were shaking as I grabbed his shoulders and tried to roll him onto his back. But the second I did, his head lolled sideways, asterisk, asterisk, eyes open. Asterisk, asterisk. I stopped breathing. The expression on his face was nothing. Just blank, frozen in time, like he had been staring at the same spot for hours. I had never seen death before. Not like this. I should have started CPR. I should have done something. But my body wasn't listening. My mind wasn't listening. The only thing I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the strangled sound of my own breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, my hands locked on his arms, waiting for him to blink, to move, to take a breath. But he never did. I let go and scrambled backward, knocking into the couch. My fingers were tingling, my chest too tight to breathe. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I don't remember what I said. I must have told them the address. Must have told them my friend wasn't breathing, that he was cold, that I didn't know what to do. Because minutes later, the dispatcher's voice faded behind the sound of sirens. The paramedics came in fast, their voices calm but firm, their hands moving without hesitation. I watched as they checked his pulse, his pupils, as they pressed on his chest and called his name. But I could already tell they knew. One of them looked at me and shook his head. That was it. I stood frozen as they stopped trying, as they covered him with a sheet, as they spoke in low voices to the police officers who had arrived. As one of the officers took my statement, I answered questions, told them he had no medical history that I knew of, that his wife was out of town, that I had only found him because she asked me to check on him. They nodded like they had seen it all before. A heart attack, they would tell me later. That was all it took. A silent failure of a muscle that had been keeping him alive for 39 years. It didn't seem fair. It didn't seem real. I must have texted his wife because she called me soon after. I could barely understand her through the crying, the disbelief in her voice as she asked me to repeat it. And then there was nothing left to do but sit on the couch, staring at the spot where he had been kneeling just hours ago. I don't know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the paramedics to leave. Long enough for the police to finish their report. Long enough for the silence of the apartment to settle deep into my bones. I don't remember the next few days. They passed in a haze of phone calls and funeral plans and awkward condolences from people who didn't know what to say. His wife returned home, and the apartment no longer felt like mine. I avoided the living room, spent most of my time in my bedroom or out of the house entirely. I kept thinking about that moment, when I touched his shoulder and knew how someone could be there 1 second and gone the next. How nothing had seemed wrong just the day before. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing I could have done, that even if I had come home earlier, it wouldn't have changed anything, that it wasn't my fault, but it didn't stop the guilt. I kept hearing his wife's voice on the phone, the way it cracked when I told her. I kept seeing his face, frozen in time, eyes open to something I couldn't see, and I kept feeling that cold on my hands. In 2005, I was still living with my parents in Florida when Hurricane Wilma hit. It was one of those storms that you knew would be bad, but you never quite expected just how much of your life it would disrupt. We were used to hurricanes, every Floridian was, but Wilma left us without electricity for what felt like forever. The storm itself had passed, but the damage it left behind was obvious everywhere. Trees were down, street signs bent at unnatural angles, roofs peeled off houses like someone had taken a giant can opener to them. The air smelled of damp wood, and there was this constant hum of generators in the distance from the few people who had been lucky enough to own one. We weren't one of those lucky families. For over a week, my parents and I lived in the thick, humid air with nothing but candles, battery-powered lanterns, and a small portable radio that crackled with storm updates and local news. Our neighborhood was eerily quiet at night. No hum of AC units, no glow of streetlights, just the occasional shuffle of someone walking outside, maybe heading to check on a neighbor or grab something from their car. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put into words. The only house near us that had power was the one directly behind ours. I don't know if they had prepared better or if they just got lucky, but their generator made their home look like an island of light in a sea of darkness. It was strange seeing their house so alive when the rest of the neighborhood was swallowed in shadows. On the second night after the storm, my dad was out in our backyard when he struck up a conversation with the man who lived behind us. The fence between our yards wasn't very high, so they just leaned on either side and talked, mostly about the storm, the lack of power, and how long it might take for things to go back to normal. The neighbor and his wife were kind people. They had 2 little girls, maybe 5 and 7 years old, and they seemed to have planned ahead much better than we had. After a bit of talking, they invited us over for dinner since they had a working stove and plenty of food. I remember walking into their house and feeling the immediate relief of moving from the thick, sticky night air into a space that was cool and bright. Even though it wasn't air-conditioned, the generator-powered fans were a blessing. We ate, made small talk, and for a little while, it felt normal, like it was just another evening and not the middle of a blackout. Eventually, the curfew set by the city forced us to head home. It was meant to keep people off the streets after dark, partly for safety and partly because emergency crews were still working on repairs. We thanked them, walked back to our dark house, and settled in for another powerless night. A couple of hours passed. My parents and I were in the den, the radio barely audible over the sound of crickets and the occasional burst of wind through the trees. The house was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting shifting shadows along the walls. It was the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel just a little bit off, like the whole world had been placed in some kind of eerie pause. That's when my dad glanced out the window and tensed. In the backyard of the neighbor's house, just at the edge where the darkness swallowed the light, there was a figure. A man. He wasn't moving much, just standing there, watching. My dad wasn't the kind to panic, but something about the way he stiffened made my stomach drop. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and called the neighbors. The wife answered, and my dad asked if her husband was outside looking for something. He offered to bring over a flashlight if he needed help. There was a long pause. Then, through the phone, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't words at first, just this weird, startled sound from the wife. Like she had gasped, but hadn't fully formed a thought yet. Then, in the background, I heard a male voice, her husband. He was inside. A few seconds later, we saw movement from inside their house as they rushed toward the back. They ran straight to the daughter's room. The man had been standing at their window, watching. We couldn't see his face from where we were, but they could. They told us later that he was positioned just right to be peering into the girl's bedroom as they were getting ready for bed. He had been standing there, completely still, staring. But the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach twist to this day, was that when they caught sight of him, he turned and ran. And as he moved, they saw his pants were partially down. My mom sucked in a breath when they told us. I felt sick. My dad, normally calm, looked furious. The police were called, but with the power out across most of the city and emergency services stretched thin, there wasn't much they could do beyond taking a report. The description was vague: an adult male, medium build, dark clothes. In the darkness, no one had gotten a clear look at his face. But then came the part that sent a shiver up my spine. The next day, the neighbors were talking to other people on the block, and someone mentioned that they thought they knew who the man was. A guy who lived just 2 or 3 houses down. He wasn't a complete stranger. I knew him. Not personally, not in any meaningful way, but I had seen him almost every single day. I had walked past his house every afternoon after school, sometimes even exchanged hellos. He had always been outside, always watching. It never seemed unusual at the time. Just a friendly neighbor acknowledging people as they walked by. But now, looking back, I felt sick. Because for years, I had gone to bed with my window curtains open. It made me feel cold all over, knowing that for so long, anyone, him, could have been standing out there in the dark watching. And I never even thought about it. Never even considered that someone might have been looking in while I slept. After that night, I never left my curtains open again. Even now, as an adult, I always check my windows before bed. I make sure they're shut, locked, and covered. It doesn't matter if I live on the 2nd floor or if my backyard is fenced in. I never leave them uncovered, because I never want to feel that vulnerable again. I never thought I'd die like this. Even in my worst nightmares, I never imagined that my last moments would be spent bound and helpless. The smell of gasoline burning my nose, knowing my family was being slaughtered feet away from me. It started like any other day. My wife and daughters left in the early evening to run errands. They were only gone for a little over an hour. I was on the couch watching TV, half dozing after a long day at work. Our youngest had been playing in the living room earlier, but she had gone upstairs to shower before bed. The house was peaceful, safe, the way it always was. I didn't hear them come back. I didn't hear the door open or the footsteps moving through the house. But I did hear my wife's voice, strangled and panicked, calling my name from the front hallway. Then came the heavy thud of boots, the weight of something pressing into the hardwood. I was still half asleep, groggy from the warmth of the couch, when I turned my head, just in time to see a shadow move past the edge of the doorway. I barely had time to register the movement before something hard slammed into the side of my head. Everything went black. I woke up on the floor, the taste of blood thick in my mouth. My head throbbed. My arms were behind me, tied so tightly that my fingers had already started going numb. The room was spinning, but I could hear my wife's breathing, fast, shallow, terrified. I lifted my head, blinking the blood from my eyes. She was next to me, on her knees, wrists bound behind her just like mine. Our daughters were in front of us. Their faces were red and swollen, their eyes wild with fear. Their hands were zip-tied, and standing over them were 2 men. One was tall, lanky, wearing dark clothes, his hair buzzed so short it looked like his scalp was shining. The other was thicker, with a rounder face and a cruel smile. He was holding a baseball bat, the same one he'd used to put me on the ground. Neither of them wore masks. That was the first thing that told me we weren't getting out of this. If they weren't covering their faces, it meant they didn't care if we saw them. It meant they weren't planning on letting us live. The night stretched on in a way that didn't feel real. I lost track of time. They moved us upstairs, forcing us onto the bed in our room, our daughters shoved into the corner of the floor. They weren't just robbing us. That much was clear. If it was money they wanted, they could have taken whatever they wanted and left. But they didn't. They were waiting for something. The thicker man paced the room, the baseball bat dragging against the carpet. His partner leaned against the dresser, flipping a knife open and closed, watching my wife. His eyes never left her. Then he pointed to her. "Get up." She did. She didn't fight. Even though she was shaking so hard, I thought her legs might give out. She was smarter than that. She knew that fighting would make it worse. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. I tried to sit up, but the other man swung the bat, knocking me back down. The door shut behind them. My daughters were silent, curled into each other. I wanted to tell them it was going to be okay, that I was going to fix this. But I couldn't, because I wasn't, because I knew I was completely helpless. My wife came back an hour later. She wasn't crying. She wasn't making a sound. She just sat down on the edge of the bed, her body trembling. I wanted to pull her into my arms to shield her, but my hands were still bound. I didn't ask her what they did to her. I already knew. The sun was rising when they decided to take her again. This time, it was the heavier man who grabbed her. "We're going for a ride," he said. She looked at me. She knew I wanted to tell her not to go, but what choice did she have? They left the house. It was just me, my daughters, and the quiet man with the knife. I don't know how much time passed before the sound of a car engine rumbled up the driveway again. She was back. She stepped inside, but she didn't come up the stairs right away. The man she had left with was shouting, his voice angry, panicked. She had gone to the bank. I realized it too late. She had told someone, and now they were panicking. I don't want to write about what happened next. I don't want to put it into words, but I will, because this is what happened. They took my daughters first. It wasn't fast. It wasn't merciful. I saw it all. So did my wife. We couldn't do anything but watch. After they were done, they left the bodies on the floor. My wife was sobbing. I wasn't. I wasn't even breathing. The heavier man stood up, cracking his knuckles. "Clean this shit up," he muttered to his partner, and then he walked out of the room. I heard the sound of cabinets slamming open, the fridge opening, then closing. I didn't understand at first. Then I smelled it. Gasoline. They weren't going to just leave us here. They were going to burn everything down. The man with the bat left. The quiet one was still in the room. He had his back turned, pouring more gasoline across the bed, and I realized that my hands were loose. The tie had slipped. I didn't think. I just moved. I threw my body forward, slamming into him. He staggered, the gas can spilling to the floor. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran. I don't remember getting out of the house. I don't remember running to the neighbor's yard, or pounding on the door, or screaming for them to call the police. I just remember the sound of sirens. And the smoke. By the time they reached the house, flames were already swallowing the walls. By the time they got inside, it was too late. I don't know why the police waited. I don't know why they sat outside for hours, watching, listening, while my family was slaughtered. Maybe they were following protocol. Maybe they thought they had time. But they didn't. And now my wife and daughters are gone. I see them when I close my eyes. I hear their voices in the quiet of my house, the house that isn't mine anymore. I go to bed alone. I wake up alone. I eat alone. And every single night, I wonder what I could have done differently. And every single night, I realize the answer is nothing. Because no matter what I did, those men had already made their choice. And so had the police. They just didn't choose us. I don't remember the sky looking different that morning. I don't remember the air feeling heavy or the wind warning us to stay ashore. If there was a sign, we missed it. Or maybe we ignored it. The men of Imouth had work to do. That was the way of things in our village. The sea gave, and the sea took, but it never stopped us from going out. There were always stories, always warnings, always someone claiming to know when disaster would strike. We listened when it suited us, but most of the time, we had no choice but to take our chances. The government had imposed unfair taxes on our catches, strangling the livelihood of every fisherman in the village. The men were left with no choice but to push harder, sail further, and work longer than they ever had before. There was no staying home just because an old man muttered about storms in his cups. The men of Imouth had families to feed. And so, on the morning of October 14th, 1881, the boats went out as they always did. I was 14. Old enough to understand what it meant when my father and brothers left before sunrise. their heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks of our cottage as they made their way to the shore. Old enough to help my mother with the washing, to mind my younger siblings, to know what to do if the worst happened, but not old enough to join them. That morning, I had stood by the door and watched them go. My father had walked ahead, carrying the weight of our family on his broad shoulders. My brothers, eager and strong, had followed, chatting between themselves as they always did. I had longed to be with them, to share in their work, to feel the salt spray on my face as the boat cut through the waves. But I had been left behind. By midday, the first signs of trouble arrived. The wind picked up, sharp and howling, rattling the windows of the cottages along the shore. Women stepped out of their homes, skirts whipping around their ankles, shielding their eyes as they looked toward the horizon. The sky, once a steady blue, had darkened to something deep and menacing. The gulls, usually screaming and diving for scraps, had vanished. The sea had begun to turn against us. I remember my mother gripping the edge of our table, her knuckles white. The baby cried in her cradle, but she didn't move to comfort her. No one spoke. The storm was still out there, rolling in from the north, and every family in Eyemouth knew what it meant. The men were still at sea. By afternoon, the storm had swallowed the village whole. Waves crashed against the shore, rising higher than the masts of the fishing boats still visible in the distance. The wind tore at roofs, sent shutters flying, and ripped washing lines from their posts. The sky was black, and the rain came in thick sheets, turning the ground to mud, stinging any skin left exposed. And then the screaming began. It wasn't from the land. It wasn't from the women huddled together, their arms wrapped around their children, their faces streaked with tears and rain. It came from the water, from the men. I ran with the others to the shore, my feet slipping in the mud, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sea was alive with destruction. Boats were capsizing, torn apart like paper, their masts splintering and breaking against the waves. Bodies, men I had known my whole life, were flung into the water, their voices barely heard over the howling wind as they screamed for help. And we could do nothing. Nothing but watch as they fought to survive. Nothing but hear their cries as the sea swallowed them, as the waves crushed their bones, as their fingers, their hands, their arms reached toward the shore, grasping for something, anything, before disappearing beneath the water. Fathers, brothers, sons. I saw my brother's boat tip sideways, the mast snapping like a twig, the weight of the storm dragging it down, pulling him and the others with it. He fought. He clawed his way to the surface, his mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear. And then he was gone. Beside me, my mother collapsed onto the sand. Her wail joined the wind, her hands clawing at the earth as if she could dig her grief into it, bury it deep where it couldn't consume her. The other women were the same, on their knees, their hands over their mouths, their eyes wide in horror. But we never looked away, because they were still out there. For hours we watched. For hours we screamed. For hours we searched the horizon, hoping, praying, begging for someone, anyone, to make it back. But the sea took them all. 189 men. The storm raged until nightfall. When the wind finally eased and the waves quieted, the beach was left covered in wreckage. Broken pieces of wood, soggy nets, a single boot, and bodies. So many bodies. Some washed ashore, their hands curled into fists, their faces frozen in fear. Others were never found, lost to the deep. The women wailed as they pulled their loved ones from the sand, as they touched their faces, as they pressed their foreheads to the cold, lifeless skin of the men they had kissed that morning. The village had died with them. Without the fishermen, there was no food, no money, no way to survive. The storm had taken more than just lives. It had taken Eyemouth itself. For weeks, the smell of salt and decay lingered in the air. Graves were dug, mourners whispered prayers, and black became the only color worn by the women in the streets. The children, too young to understand, tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking when their fathers would come home. But they never would. Even now, the village remembers. Every year, on the 14th of October, we gather on the shore, standing in the very place where our ancestors watched their loved ones die. Some say if you listen closely, you can still hear them, the voices of the lost, carried on the wind, crying out for help that will never come. I don't need to listen, because I remember. I never thought about home invasions. Sure, I locked my doors at night. I set the alarm before bed. But the idea of someone actually breaking in, actually coming inside while my wife and kids slept. That felt like something that happened to other people. The kind of thing you saw in the news, shook your head at, and then moved on with your day. But the night they came, there was no warning, no alarm, no shattering glass or kicked down door, no barking dog or flickering security camera to let us know that our world was about to change forever. It started earlier in the evening. My wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Emily, had gone to the store. Just a quick trip to pick up groceries for the week. I stayed home with our younger son, Josh, watching TV in the living room. It was a normal night, just like any other. The kids had school in the morning. I had work. Nothing felt off. When Sarah and Emily came back, they parked in the driveway, grabbed the bags, and walked inside. They didn't notice the car idling at the end of the street. They didn't notice the two men sitting inside watching them. I didn't notice either. Not until later. I was already asleep when it happened. It must have been after midnight. One moment, I was deep in a dream, and the next, I woke up to something pressing against my skull. Hard. Cold. My body was slow to react, my mind still foggy from sleep, but then I realized what it was. A gun. A man was standing over me in the dark, his face masked, his voice low. "Don't move." I didn't. I heard Sarah before I saw her. A muffled cry. I turned my head just enough to see the shape of another man gripping her by the wrist, holding something against her neck. I wanted to fight, to launch myself at them, but I could see the gun. I could see the way Sarah was shaking, and I knew if I did anything, they would kill her. "Get up," the man with the gun said. Slow. I did as I was told. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. "Where are the kids?" I didn't answer right away. He hit me in the ribs, hard enough to knock the wind out of me. "Where are the kids?" "Down the hall," I gasped. "First and second doors on the left." He looked at the other man and nodded. The second man dragged Sarah out of the room, while the first one kept the gun trained on me. I could hear her footsteps, hear her breathing, and then I heard Emily scream. I lunged toward the door, but the gunman slammed me back against the bed. "Don't be stupid." I couldn't move. My daughter's scream was like a knife to the gut. And then I heard Josh, my 8-year-old son. His voice was high and scared and confused. "Daddy." I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth would crack. "Go," the man said. He forced me out of the bedroom and down the hall, and that's when I saw them. Sarah, Emily, and Josh, all on their knees in the living room. Their hands were tied behind their backs with duct tape, their mouths covered. I wanted to throw up. The second man shoved me down beside them. The carpet felt rough against my bare knees. For a long time, they didn't say anything. They just stood over us, looking, deciding. Then the taller one, the one who had dragged Sarah, spoke. "We're going to take a little trip to the bank." He nudged Sarah with his boot. "You're coming with me." I shook my head. "Please don't." The shorter one kicked me in the stomach so hard I collapsed forward, gasping. I felt hands grabbing my wrists, yanking them behind my back. Tape wrapped tight. Too tight. My shoulders ached. "Please." I tried again, but the taller man ignored me. He grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her to her feet. I watched her go, helpless. The front door closed behind them, and then it was just us. Me, my kids, and the man with the gun. Time moved slow. I don't know how long we sat there. Maybe an hour. Maybe more. My knees throbbed. My shoulders burned. My head pounded. And then the phone rang. The man answered. "Yeah." A pause. "Okay. No, she didn't do anything stupid." "Yeah, I'll start." "Start." He hung up, turned to look at us. And then he smiled. He stepped toward Emily. And I understood. I screamed behind the tape. Josh started crying. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. I fought. I fought so hard I felt my wrists tear open against the tape. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop what they did to her. Or what they did to Sarah when they brought her back. I wasn't strong enough. When it was over, I thought they'd finally leave. Take the money. Take whatever they wanted. Just leave us alone. But they weren't done. The smell of gasoline filled the air. The taller man dragged Sarah into another room. I could hear her struggling. Could hear her sobbing. Then a muffled gunshot. Josh whimpered beside me. The shorter man stepped forward, a lighter in his hand. And that's when something snapped inside me. I wrenched my arms up, ignoring the pain, forcing them through my legs so that my hands were in front of me instead of behind. Then I ran. I slammed into the shorter man, knocking him off balance. I sprinted for the door, hitting it with my shoulder. It burst open, and I stumbled outside. I ran. I don't know how I made it to the neighbor's house. I don't remember anything but running. But then I was there, hammering on their door, screaming through the tape. The door opened. The police were already outside, standing there, watching the house. I tried to scream at them, to tell them what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was still taped shut. And then I heard the explosion. I turned just in time to see the flames. They didn't burn fast enough. The firefighters were already there. The cops, too. They could have stopped it. They could have gone in, but they didn't. I screamed at them to move, to help, but they just stood there. By the time they went in, it was too late. Emily, Josh, Sarah, gone, just gone, and I was alone. I used to work for the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania, stationed on the mental health unit of a prison that was close to 100 years old. The place had history, deep, unsettling history. The kind that settled into the walls, soaked into the floors, and lingered in the air long after whatever horrors had taken place there were forgotten. Even on normal nights, the building groaned and creaked under its own weight, shifting like an old body settling into a chair. But that night was different. It had been storming since early evening. The kind of storm that rattled windows and sent sheets of rain pounding against the roof like fists. Thunder rolled over the prison in slow, deep waves, shaking the walls, and the lights flickered every few minutes, struggling to stay on. The generators were old, unreliable, and with every flicker, the shadows in the halls stretched and moved like they were alive. I was in the office with my coworkers, finishing up the shift's paperwork. We were tired but used to the long hours, used to the unpredictable chaos that came with working in a place like this. The mental health unit wasn't like the general population. It was a world of its own. Some of the inmates were deeply disturbed, lost in their own minds, living in realities the rest of us couldn't see. Others were manipulative, intelligent, playing the system like a game. And then there were the ones like him. Inmate blank. I can't say his name. I won't, but I can tell you what he did. He was here because he had killed 4 people. He had eaten part of one of them. There was no insanity plea. He knew exactly what he was doing. But he was still housed in the mental health unit because no one knew what else to do with him. He wasn't safe for general population. He wasn't safe for anyone. Most of the time, he was quiet. Too quiet. He had this way of watching people that made your skin crawl, like he wasn't looking at you. He was studying you, picking you apart in his mind, piece by piece. We never turned our backs on him. Even with the heavy, reinforced cell doors and the thick glass separating him from the rest of the unit, he made us uneasy. I had worked there long enough to think I had seen it all. I was wrong. The scream came out of nowhere. A sound so raw, so full of agony and something deeper, something primal, that it sent a chill straight through my spine. We froze. For a moment, none of us moved. Then the office door burst open, and a CO ran inside. His face was pale, eyes wide, chest heaving. I had never seen him look like that before. He only managed a few words. Inmate blank is eating himself. We ran, down the hallway, past the other cells. Inmates were awake now, some pressed against the doors, trying to see what was happening. Others were yelling, shouting, feeding off the chaos. We reached his cell and stopped dead. Through the reinforced glass, we could see him. He was sitting on the floor, hunched over his own arms. Blood covered his hands, his face, the front of his shirt. The flesh on his forearms was torn open deep, gaping wounds where skin and muscle had been ripped away. And he was still going, tearing off chunks, chewing, swallowing. His teeth were stained red, his mouth stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't far from it either. Then lightning flashed. For a split second, everything lit up. The hallway, the cell, his face. And that's when I saw it. His eyes, empty, hollow, and the way his mouth twisted, the way he looked at us as he chewed, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he wanted us to see. Someone shouted for a nurse. Someone else radioed for the warden. I couldn't move. I had seen violence before. I had seen fights, injuries, things most people would never have to see in their lives. But this was different. This wasn't anger. This wasn't desperation. This was something else. When the COs finally got into the cell, he fought. He thrashed, kicked, spat blood at them, laughing. That twisted grin never left his face. He didn't say a word. Not once. It took 3 men to hold him down long enough to sedate him. Even after the needle went in, Even as his body started to go limp, he still stared at us, still grinned. They took him to the hospital. I should have been relieved that he was gone, even if only for a while. But I wasn't, because he wasn't finished. At the hospital, as they were treating his injuries, he attacked a nurse. She had been leaning in too close, trying to clean one of the deeper wounds on his arm. He lunged, bit down, tried to rip her nose off. They had to sedate him again, heavier this time, restrain him completely. After that, I don't know what happened to him. They moved him, somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the system. We never got details, and we didn't ask. But I still dream about that night, about the blood, the sound of teeth tearing into flesh, the way he smiled in the lightning flash, like he wasn't in pain, like he wasn't suffering, like he was enjoying it. And every time a storm rolls in, every time thunder shakes the walls and the lights flicker, I feel it again. That same cold, crawling fear. Because I know that somewhere out there, he's still smiling, and he's still hungry. I was 16 when I became a murder witness. Or maybe I wasn't. To this day, I don't even know what to call myself because I never actually saw anything. I never saw the crime happen. I never saw the body. I never saw the moment a life was taken. But I still ended up in an interrogation room, sitting alone under fluorescent lights, being told that if I didn't talk, I would be considered an accomplice. The date was April 1st. A joke, right? It had to be a joke. That's what I told myself when he first confessed. We were kids, just stupid teenagers who barely understood the weight of what life even was. He told me what he did, casually, like it was nothing. I didn't believe him. I didn't want to believe him. But when the police showed up, when they started asking questions, when I was pulled into that suffocating little room and kept there for hours, my stomach twisted with something heavy and sharp. I never told them everything. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wanted to protect myself. I held on to that date like it was my last lifeline. April 1st. A prank. A lie. A twisted little story that got out of hand. But it wasn't. He was found guilty. 8 years. It felt like forever at the time, but I know better now. 8 years is nothing. 8 years go by in the blink of an eye. When you're young, time stretches out like an endless road. You think you'll never reach the end of it. You think things will always be the way they are. But then time runs out, and suddenly you're standing at the edge, looking back at something you never really left behind. The calls started not long after he went to prison. At first, it was just breathing on the other end of the line. Heavy, slow, like he was letting me know he was there without saying a word. Then, the words came. "Did you have fun at the club last night?" I felt my stomach drop the first time I heard that. I hadn't told anyone I was going out. I hadn't posted about it. But he knew. "You looked good in that dress." It was worse than being followed. Worse than being watched. It was a reminder that no matter what I did, I could never really get away from him. I changed my number. A few days later, the phone rang again. "You thought you got rid of me, didn't you?" I never told anyone. I was ashamed. I felt guilty. I kept telling myself that maybe if I had said more during the investigation, maybe if I had given them more details, maybe if I hadn't convinced myself that it was all just a joke, he wouldn't be able to do this to me. I had the chance to stop him, and I didn't. Now, he was making sure I wouldn't forget it. For a while, it was constant. The calls, the letters, the feeling of being watched. But then, after a few years, it stopped. I stopped answering. I stopped reacting. I moved on with my life. And it seemed like he did too. I even visited him once. I don't know why I did it. Maybe to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid anymore. Maybe to make peace with it. Maybe just to see what he had become. But after that, I forgot about him. I really, truly forgot. Until the night he showed up at my parents' house. It was late. I was out with my friends, my boyfriend at the time sitting next to me, when my phone rang. It was my old neighbor, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Sit down," she said. "Breathe." I remember how cold my hands felt when she told me. He was at my parents' door. He was looking for me. He was disguised, but she knew it was him. My dad answered the door, confused, asking what he wanted. He only had one answer. "I'm here to take her with me." I drove straight to the police station. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I thought, asterisk, this is it. This is where it ends. Asterisk, I walked inside, breathless, shaking, and told them he had escaped. They laughed. It wasn't possible, they said. No one had ever escaped from that prison. He was in a top-security facility, locked away where no one could get out. I insisted. I begged them to check. And when they did, their faces went pale. He was gone. The phone rang again. My hands were shaking as I picked up. The cops leaned in, waiting for something they could use. They weren't thinking about my safety. They didn't care about what this meant for me. They just wanted to know where he was. I didn't fall for it. I hung up. For days, my parents' house was under surveillance. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined him outside the window, watching, waiting. And then he came back. The house was dark when I heard him. The door creaked. Footsteps. My father was with me. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I felt calm, like something in me had already accepted what was happening. He was inside. We told him the police were outside, that he needed to go. He asked if I wanted to go with him. I said no, and then he was gone. 2 weeks later, they caught him. Same city, same streets. He still had a gun in his pocket. It never made the news. There was no story, no evidence, no proof that any of it had ever happened. But I remember every phone call, every whispered threat, every second of silence when I knew he was watching. And sometimes I still wonder. April 1st. Maybe it was all just a joke after all. I was 13 when my family decided to take a trip to Key West, Florida. Living in South Florida, I was accustomed to the tropical climate and coastal scenery, so the journey didn't initially promise any novel experiences. However, one evening, we embarked on a ghost tour that would leave an indelible mark on my young mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quaint streets of Key West, our group gathered near a historic cemetery. The tour guide, a man with a weathered face and a voice that seemed to carry the weight of countless tales, began recounting stories of the island's past. Among the various legends, one story stood out, a tale both haunting and disturbingly real. In the early 1900s, a German-born radiology technician named Karl Tanzler made his way to the United States. After various travels, he settled in Key West, taking a position at the Marine Hospital. Tanzler was an enigmatic figure, often sharing stories of his youth, including vivid visions of a dark-haired woman he believed was his destined love. On April 22, 1930, fate seemed to intervene. Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, a local Cuban-American woman renowned for her beauty, was brought to the hospital by her mother. Elena, as she was affectionately known, had been diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that, at the time, was often a death sentence. Upon meeting her, Tanzler was convinced she was the woman from his visions. Despite Elena being legally married to Luis Mesa, who had left her after a miscarriage, Tanzler's obsession grew. He took it upon himself to treat her, employing a range of methods from medical equipment to homemade remedies, all administered in the Hoyos family home. He showered Elena with gifts, professing his love, though there was no evidence she reciprocated his feelings. Tragically, on October 25, 1931, Elena succumbed to the disease. Tanzler, devastated, offered to pay for her funeral and commissioned the construction of an above-ground mausoleum in the Key West Cemetery. With her family's permission, he visited the mausoleum almost every night, serenading her with Spanish songs and speaking to her as if she were still alive. But grief and obsession soon led Tanzler down a darker path. In April 1933, he removed Elena's body from the mausoleum, transporting it to his home under the cover of night. There, he undertook macabre efforts to preserve her remains. He used piano wire to secure her bones and replaced decomposed skin with silk cloth soaked in wax and plaster of Paris. As her hair fell out, he fashioned a wig from locks he had previously obtained from her mother. To maintain her form, he filled the cavities of her body with rags and dressed her in fine clothing, jewelry, and gloves. To mask the odor of decomposition, he applied copious amounts of perfume and disinfectants. For 7 years, Tanzler lived with Elena's corpse, treating it as his wife. Neighbors reported seeing him dancing with a life-size doll through his window, unaware of the true nature of his partner. Rumors began to circulate, and in October 1940, Elena's sister, Florinda, confronted Tanzler. Authorities were notified, and upon investigation, they discovered the preserved body of Elena in his home. The public was both horrified and morbidly fascinated. Elena's body was examined by physicians and pathologists and was even put on public display at the Dean Lopez funeral home, where thousands came to view the macabre spectacle. Eventually, her remains were reburied in an unmarked grave to prevent further tampering. As the tour guide concluded this chilling tale, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The reality of Tanzler's obsession and the lengths he went to preserve his version of love blurred the lines between devotion and madness. That night, as I lay in bed, the story replayed in my mind, igniting a fascination with the darker facets of human nature and the mysteries that linger in the shadows of history. I've always loved animals. As a kid, while other kids were into dolls or action figures, I was the one bringing home stray cats, catching frogs from the creek, and watching animal documentaries for fun. So when I got my first snake, a small ball python, I knew I had found my kind of pet. Quiet, easy to care for, fascinating to watch, snakes were perfect for me. Over time, my interest grew, and so did the size of my snakes. By the time I moved to Los Angeles, I had a few smaller snakes, but my pride and joy was Rook, a reticulated python I had raised since he was small enough to fit in my palm. Retics are massive snakes, some of the longest in the world, but Rook was manageable when I got him, no thicker than my thumb. Over the years, he grew into a sleek, beautiful predator, patterned in gold and black, stretching over 10 feet. He was strong, intelligent in the way snakes can be, and calm. I knew people were afraid of snakes. I heard the comments when I told them I had one. What if it gets loose? Aren't they dangerous? You're not worried it'll kill you in your sleep? I always laughed it off. People didn't understand snakes. They weren't malicious. They didn't attack people for fun. If you respected them, handled them properly, and fed them well, there was nothing to fear. Rook had never shown aggression toward me. I trusted him completely. I even let him sleep in my bed. Not every night, of course, but sometimes. I had a large, custom-built enclosure for him, secure and warm, but I'd let him out to explore while I read or watched TV, and sometimes he'd curl up at the foot of my bed and stay there. It was comforting, in a strange way. Some people had dogs or cats. I had Rook. Then his behavior changed. It started small, little things I noticed but brushed off. He was refusing food. That wasn't unheard of. Snakes could go weeks, even months, without eating, especially if they were preparing to shed. I checked his eyes for cloudiness, but they were clear. I checked the temperature in his enclosure. Perfect. Humidity levels were fine. No signs of sickness. But he still wouldn't eat. At first, I figured maybe he wasn't hungry. I tried offering food again a few days later. Still nothing. Live, frozen thawed, fresh kill. Didn't matter. He showed no interest. Then, he started acting restless. Normally, when he was out of his enclosure, he'd explore for a while and then settle somewhere, coiled under my coffee table, stretched out along my couch, or resting near the foot of my bed. But now he wouldn't stay still. He moved constantly, his tongue flicking the air, weaving himself over my furniture, around my arms, always shifting. At night, when I let him out, he stopped curling up at the foot of my bed. Instead, he stretched out. The first time I noticed, I thought it was odd but not alarming. I was lying on my back, half asleep, when I realized he wasn't in his usual spot. I could feel his weight against my legs, then my stomach, then my chest. I opened my eyes. Rook was stretched out alongside me, from my toes to the top of my head, his head resting near my shoulder. It felt strange. Not scary, just off. I ran my fingers along his scales. He didn't react. I shifted a little, and he adjusted, his body flexing slightly before going still again. I assumed he was just exploring, so I let it go. The next night, the same thing happened. And the next. Every night, I'd wake up to find him stretched out alongside me. At first, I tried to convince myself it was normal. Maybe he liked the warmth. Maybe he wanted to be close. Maybe I was imagining the pattern. But something felt wrong. His refusal to eat, his constant movement, the way he seemed fixated on me, it started to gnaw at me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I knew Rook. He wasn't dangerous. I had handled him for years. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Finally, I decided to take him to the vet. I lived in Los Angeles, where exotic pet vets weren't hard to find, so I made an appointment and brought him in. The vet was an older man, someone who had seen every kind of snake imaginable. He listened as I explained Rook's behavior, how he had stopped eating, how he was moving more than usual, how he had started stretching out alongside me at night. I remember the way his expression changed. At first, he looked neutral, like he was just taking in the information. Then slowly, his mouth pressed into a thin line and his brow furrowed. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if Rook had ever done this before. I shook my head. No, never. He exhaled, nodded slightly, and leaned back. Then he told me very calmly that I needed to get rid of Rook immediately. I didn't understand. I asked why. Then, he told me something that made my stomach drop. He said Rook wasn't just acting strange, he was preparing. The reason he wasn't eating? He was fasting, emptying his stomach to make room for a large meal. The reason he was stretching out alongside me? He was measuring me, seeing if I would fit inside of him. The air felt sucked out of the room. My head went light. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say he was wrong. But suddenly, everything clicked into place. The restless behavior, the constant movement, the way he hadn't eaten in weeks, the way he stretched out beside me at night, from my toes to the top of my head. I don't remember much of what I said after that. I think I nodded. I think I asked if there was any way to fix it. The vet was firm. Rook had to go. He told me that large constrictors don't see humans as prey until they do. And once they do, there's no going back. I drove home in silence, Rook coiled in his carrier beside me. I could hear him shifting inside, his scales rasping against the plastic. My hands were shaking. That night, I didn't take him out. I kept him locked in his enclosure, staring at him from across the room. He stared back, unblinking, his head slightly raised, tongue flicking. The next morning, I made the call. I found a reptile sanctuary willing to take him. No questions, no judgment. I drove 2 hours to drop him off, carrying his heavy body one last time. I didn't say goodbye. I just handed him over and walked away. My bed felt strangely empty that night. For years, I had trusted him. I had let him sleep in my bed. I had loved him. And all that time, he had been waiting until I was just the right size, waiting until he was hungry enough, waiting for the perfect moment. And if I hadn't gone to the vet when I did, I might not have woken up. I was awake, but I couldn't feel my body. The bright overhead lights in the operating room reflected off the steel trays, making everything look too clean, too sterile. The beeping of monitors filled the air, steady and rhythmic, along with the sound of voices, calm, controlled. Chatting like this was just another day in the office. I wasn't nervous anymore, not really. The hard part was over. My baby was out. My doctor, a woman I trusted more than anyone in that moment, was focused on putting me back together. The spinal block had taken away all feeling from my chest down, so all I knew of my body was what I could see. Arms resting at my sides, a blue surgical drape cutting me off from the mess below. My head felt clear. Everything was going great. We were talking, though I don't even remember what about. Just meaningless conversation to fill the time. Something about random things. Maybe the weather, maybe some dumb TV show. I don't even know how long I was lying there before it happened. Before the exhaustion hit. Not normal exhaustion. Not tired from lack of sleep. Not tired from labor. Not tired like anything I'd ever felt before. It was an unbearable weight, dragging me down like I was sinking into the table itself. My eyelids weren't just heavy. They were impossible to keep open. My body wasn't just sluggish, it was shutting down. I had no desire to see my baby. No rush of adrenaline. No excitement. Just overwhelming, absolute nothing. And then silence. I didn't realize how much noise had been in the room until it was gone. No more voices. No beeping. No background hum of machinery. Just an emptiness that stretched out, swallowing everything whole. Then I started floating. It wasn't a sudden jolt or a dramatic pull, just a slow, effortless drift. My body was on the table, but I was somewhere else. 3 feet up, maybe more. Weightless, detached. But the strangest thing was how good it felt. It wasn't happiness. That word is too small, too weak. It wasn't joy, wasn't euphoria, wasn't relief in the way people describe relief. It was a complete absence of everything: stress, worry, pain, fear, even thought itself. Just being. A deep, endless contentment I have never felt before and have never felt since. I could see them, the people in the room. My doctor, the nurses, the anesthesiologist. Everything was continuing without me, and I didn't care. I couldn't care. The feeling was too powerful. Then I saw him, the guy monitoring my vitals. He was writing something, glancing at the monitor like it was just routine, like he was barely paying attention. Then he stopped. His body stiffened. His eyes widened, darting back and forth between the numbers on the screen. His pen dropped from his hand. Oh shit. The words barely registered before he moved. He grabbed something, a syringe, rushed toward me, toward my four, and pushed the medication in. Then, impact, a gunshot in my skull, a crack of noise so loud it shattered the silence. A force slammed me back down onto the table, crushing me under a weight so heavy I couldn't breathe. I wasn't floating anymore. I wasn't weightless. I was trapped. The beeping was back, frantic, loud, overlapping. The voices were shouting, rushing, moving around me. My body was shaking. Uncontrollable chills ran through me, waves of them, rattling my teeth, making my hands tremble so hard my fingers curled in on themselves. The cold was unbearable. It was inside me, in my bones, in my chest. I could feel everything now, too much all at once. The pressure, the exhaustion, the pain that wasn't pain but something worse. I wasn't floating anymore. I was stuck in this body, and it was broken. Then nothing. I don't remember that night. Not a single thing. I don't know how long I lay there, don't know what they did, don't know what was said. My mind was blank, too exhausted to hold on to anything. Time didn't exist. There was just an empty void between that moment and the next day. The first thing I remember was a nurse. She walked in like it was just another day, casual, professional, no sign that anything had gone wrong. Her voice was light when she asked, "Have the blood transfusion people been by yet?" I blinked at her. My throat was dry. "No." She frowned. "Huh." Then she left. When she came back, my doctor was with her. And then they told me. I had bled out. They'd struggled to contain it. I had lost more than half my blood volume before they got it under control. And no one had told me. No one had mentioned it when I woke up. No one had explained why my body felt like it had been hollowed out and refilled with something wrong. Then, the next day, the nurses laughed. "Oh, you look so much better today," one of them said, smiling. "We were surprised you were even able to walk the first day." Like it was funny. Like it was nothing. Like I hadn't died on that table. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask questions. Because it didn't matter. Nothing mattered the way it had before. Because I knew. I knew what it felt like to die. And that was the part that terrified me the most. Not the blood loss. Not the fact that no one had told me. Not the pain or the shaking or the night I couldn't remember. The fact that it had felt better than being alive. And I've never been able to let go of that feeling. It's been years. My body has never been the same. I've had cancer. I've lost my reproductive system. Both of my parents are dead. And I am still here. But I don't feel like I should be. Nothing in life has ever come close to that feeling. That peace, that stillness, that overwhelming contentment. Not joy, not love, not even the birth of my children. And that is what scares me more than anything. Not death. Living. I don't remember much from when I was 5, but some memories never fade, no matter how young you were when they happened. Some things get locked into your brain so deep that even years later, no matter how much time has passed, they still feel fresh. I don't remember what I ate that morning, or what I was wearing, or even what day of the week it was. But I remember the heat of the summer sun against my skin. I remember the way the parking lot smelled, hot asphalt, a mix of car exhaust, and the faint scent of groceries drifting through the air. I remember the sound of my baby brother babbling, his little feet kicking against the car seat. I remember my older brother tugging at my mom's sleeve, begging for money to buy a snack. And most of all, I remember the exact moment when everything changed. Back in the late 90s, we used to get our drinking water from the grocery store, filling up these huge, heavy 10-gallon jugs at a machine outside. It was just something we did, something normal, something routine. My mom was a single parent with 3 kids, and we ran errands like this all the time. She had parked the car right in front of the store, as close to the water machine as possible, so she could keep an eye on us while she filled the jugs. The car was running because it was too hot to leave us inside without the AC. It was supposed to be quick. My older brother was the first to get out, practically bouncing on his feet, begging my mom for money to go inside and buy chips. I remember watching him, thinking how lucky he was. He got to go inside, and I didn't. I wanted to go too. Without thinking much about it, I unbuckled myself from my booster seat. Then, out of habit, because that's just what I always did, I turned and unbuckled my baby brother too. He was just a toddler, still in a car seat, barely able to walk without stumbling. I scooped him up, his little arms wrapping around my neck, and I followed my older brother into the store. We weren't gone long, maybe a couple of minutes. I don't even remember if I ended up getting anything, or if I just trailed behind my brother, watching him pick out a bag of chips. But when we stepped back outside, something was wrong. My mom wasn't at the water machine anymore. She was standing where the car had been, but the car wasn't there. It was gone. Just gone. At first, I didn't understand. I was a kid. I didn't have the ability to process what I was seeing. My mom wasn't moving. Her hands were pressed to her mouth, and she was staring at the empty space where the car had been. People were walking past, pushing carts, carrying grocery bags, completely unaware that anything had happened. The world looked exactly the same as it had when we walked into the store. But it wasn't the same. Something was missing. Something was wrong. Then, my mom turned around, and I saw her face. She had been crying. Even at that age, I knew what crying looked like. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her face was twisted with something I couldn't understand. It was more than just sadness, it was fear. She looked completely lost, like someone had taken all the air out of her lungs. That's when it hit me. The car had been stolen. And if I hadn't decided to get out when I did, if I hadn't taken my baby brother with me, we would have been inside ***. Even now, all these years later, I can't stop thinking about that moment. That one choice. If I had stayed buckled in my booster seat, if I had left my baby brother strapped in, what would have happened? The thought makes my stomach tighten, even as an adult. I don't know who took the car. I don't know if they realized there were kids inside when they got in, or if they even cared. Would they have just dumped us on the side of the road somewhere? Would they have hurt us? Would they have driven us far away, somewhere we'd never be found? I don't know. What I do know is that for hours, hours, no one knew where our car was. The police were called. My mom was frantic, talking to officers outside the grocery store, trying to explain what had happened. I remember standing there, still holding my baby brother, watching as people moved around us like nothing was wrong, like our entire world hadn't just turned upside down. Eventually, my mom took us home. I don't remember much about that night, except that she held us both a little tighter than usual. She kept looking at me in this strange way, half grateful, half heartbroken, like she was seeing me for the first time. The car was missing for days. It was found about 50 miles away, dumped on the side of the road. Whoever had taken it didn't bother to keep it. They just drove it as far as they wanted, then abandoned it. I never found out who they were, if they were caught, if they had stolen other cars before. But I know this, if I hadn't gotten out of that car, if I hadn't taken my baby brother with me, our lives could have ended that day. My mom still thanks me. Even now, she'll bring it up sometimes out of nowhere. She'll look at me and shake her head and say, I don't even want to think about what could have happened if you hadn't taken your brother with you. And the truth is, I don't want to think about it either. But I do. I always do.